The Female Errand Boy. The Crimes of Lois Schwich in Victorian London. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Author's note. This book began with a woman who appeared in the historical record only briefly, and only once she had become useful to the people recording her. Lois Schwich, sometimes rendered Schwick in period material, survives in fragments, newspaper reports, court coverage, and the hard outlines left behind by institutions concerned less with preserving the fullness of working-class lives than with naming, judging, and punishing them. Like many poor women of the 19th century, she was not granted the luxury of leaving behind a neat and self-explaining archive. There are no known diaries here, no bundle of family letters, no long memoir in which she tells us plainly who she believed herself to be. What remains is partial, uneven, and often shaped by the moral habits of the age. That incompleteness has guided the writing of this book. Where the record is clear, I have followed it. Where the record is thin, I have resisted the temptation to turn silence into certainty. The broader world of Victorian London, its labor, poverty, commerce, gender expectations, pawn culture, and newspaper sensationalism, can be recovered with far greater fullness than the inner life of Lois herself. For that reason, this book places her story within its historical setting while taking care not to invent private motives, conversations, or emotions that cannot now be known. When her family history, education, and domestic circumstances appear, they are treated cautiously and in keeping with what can reasonably be inferred from the surviving evidence and from the social realities of the period. That choice matters. Too often, women like Lois are flattened in one of two directions. They are turned either into romantic victims, their wrongdoing softened into pure tragedy, or into crude villains, stripped of context and made to stand as moral warnings. Neither approach seemed sufficient to me. Lois Schwich was almost certainly shaped by poverty, limited opportunities, and the brutal narrowness of women's labor in the 19th century. She also appears to have deceived employers and stolen from them. Both things can be true at once. To admit complexity is not to excuse wrongdoing. It is simply to refuse the false comfort of a cleaner story than the archive can honestly support. Readers will notice that this book is written in a restrained narrative voice rather than as a fictional reconstruction. That, too, is deliberate. The surviving material invites atmosphere, but it does not justify invention. My aim has been to restore depth without manufacturing certainty, to place Lois back into the city that shaped her, the trades that employed her, the pressures that narrowed her choices, and the public culture that first sensationalized her and then abandoned her. If the book leaves some questions open, it does so because history has left them open. The spellings of names in Victorian sources are not always consistent, and Lois's surname appears in more than one form. I have used Schwich as the primary form throughout, while acknowledging that variant spellings exist in contemporary reporting. This is not unusual in 19th century material, especially in cases involving working-class people whose lives were recorded only briefly and often carelessly. In writing this book, I have been mindful that archives are not neutral places. They preserve power as much as truth. They record the poor most clearly at the point of crisis, accusation, or punishment. A woman may live for years in hardship without leaving much trace, then suddenly become visible because she is arrested, tried, or sentenced. That kind of visibility is not generosity. It is one of the more enduring cruelties of the historical record. Part of the task here has been to look past the official fascination with offense and ask what else can still be seen. This is, then, not a story about an exception so much as a story about a city. It is about Victorian London and the world it made possible. A world in which clothes could open doors, poverty could force ingenuity into secrecy, respectability could be performed, and the distance between work and theft could narrow under pressure. Lois Schwich stands at the center of this story, but she is also one of many half-visible figures who moved through the 19th century under burdens the record only partly admits. If this book succeeds, I hope it does so not by solving her entirely, but by returning to her some of the difficulty that her own time denied her. She was more than a headline, more than a courtroom curiosity. More than a cautionary tale. She was a real woman who passed briefly through the machinery of Victorian judgment and left behind just enough of herself to remind us how much is lost when history listens only at the moment of punishment. Introduction. In late 19th century London, clothing did more than cover the body. It announced station, wages, respectability, and intent. A coat could open a door. An apron could disarm suspicion. A cap, a collar, a pair of properly cut trousers might carry a person across thresholds that would otherwise remain shut. In a city ruled by appearances, dress was a form of speech, and those who understood its language could move through London almost unseen. Lois Schwich understood that language well. By the time her name appeared in the newspapers, she had already crossed several boundaries that respectable society liked to imagine were fixed. She had crossed the line between female and male employment, between servant and employee, between poverty and pretense, between necessity and crime. In court and in print she was transformed into a curiosity, a warning, and a spectacle. A young woman who had presented herself as a boy, found work in respectable businesses, and been accused of stealing from those who trusted her. The facts of the case were startling enough. The reaction to them was even more revealing. Victorian London knew how to talk about theft. It knew how to talk about fallen women, dishonest servants, juvenile offenders, and the criminal poor. It was less comfortable when those categories overlapped, and less comfortable still when sex, dress, labor, and identity became entangled in the same person. Lois Schwich unsettled easy judgments. She could be described as a thief, and she was. She could be described as an imposter, and she was that too. Yet she also emerged from a world in which the choices available to poor girls were narrow, insecure, and often badly paid. Where a boy might be sent out to earn, carry, fetch, learn a trade, or move freely through the streets, a girl was more likely to be watched, limited, and sorted into service or drudgery. If she wanted access to the city's masculine spaces, she needed to borrow the appearance of belonging. That decision, if decision it was, lay at the center of her story. Much about Lois Schwich remains uncertain. Like many of the working poor, she did not leave behind diaries, letters, or carefully preserved family papers. What survives is fragmentary. Newspaper reports, court proceedings, and the hard, selective record left by institutions more interested in controlling the poor than understanding them. Her background must therefore be approached with caution. The broad outline suggests hardship. She was said to have supported her mother and younger siblings. Whether out of desperation, determination, or both, she entered the labor market in male dress and sought work in shops and businesses that would not readily have opened to her as a girl. If her education was slight, she was not unusual. Schooling for children of the poor was often irregular, interrupted by work, illness, overcrowding, and the constant pressure of household need. Whatever formal education she had received, she possessed another kind of knowledge: how to observe, how to imitate, how to make herself credible, and how to move through the city without drawing attention. These were not minor skills. In London, they could mean the difference between employment and hunger. The city into which Lois stepped was vast, harsh, and intensely theatrical. Goods traveled constantly through it: cloth, gloves, hats, boots, ribbons, household linens, remnants, cut pieces, parcels, and finished garments. So did messages, money, gossip, and opportunity. Beneath the polished surfaces of West End commerce lay an economy of leakage and loss. Goods went missing from counters, workshops, and storerooms. Employers relied on trust and routine, but trust was fragile and routine could be studied. The same streets that carried respectable trade also fed pawnshops, fences, second-hand dealers, and all the smaller shadow economies that made theft profitable. A missing length of cloth or a pair of trousers was never merely an object gone astray. It was a thread connecting workshop to street, labor to temptation, scarcity to risk. Lois found work in this world first as an errand boy in a tailor's establishment. It was the sort of position that depended on movement and obedience. An errand boy was expected to carry messages, collect parcels, run goods between premises, and make himself useful without becoming memorable. He was seen everywhere and noticed nowhere. It was an ideal role for someone who needed access and anonymity in equal measure. That Lois secured such a post at all was a sign of her success in presentation. She was sufficiently convincing to be hired, trusted, and sent about on business. She had crossed over not only in dress, but in function. Then things began to disappear. At first there were missing garments and missing pieces of cloth, losses that might in another shop have been dismissed as carelessness, error, or ordinary wastage. But suspicion accumulated. Lois moved on and found employment elsewhere, this time in another branch of the clothing trade. Again there was access. Again there was trust. Again goods went missing. Eventually the pattern sharpened into a case, and the case into a prosecution. Once the police entered the story, another Victorian machinery began to turn. Identification, evidence, pawn tickets, recovered goods, testimony, sentence. Yet even then, theft alone was not enough to satisfy the public appetite. The newspapers seized on the more saleable detail. The accused was not simply a thief, but a female thief in male attire. The crime report became a social drama. This was the Victorian press, at one of its favorite tasks, taking a human life and flattening it into a moral exhibit. At moments, Lois was granted a thin layer of pity. If she had disguised herself to support a struggling household, that could be made to sound almost dutiful. But pity in the 19th century press was fickle. It rarely survived the presence of repeated theft, or the suggestion of calculation. Once the value of the stolen goods came into clearer view, sympathy curdled. The figure who had briefly appeared as an unfortunate girl driven by circumstance hardened into something more threatening, deceptive, unfeminine, dishonest, and undeserving. The same newspapers that relished her novelty were quick to punish it. And still, the fascination remained. Part of that fascination lay in the fact that Lois Schwich's story exposed the instability of categories the period preferred to treat as natural. What separated honest labor from criminal opportunity when both required the same skills of performance and movement? What separated the respectable shop boy from the impostor when the uniform, the manner, and the work could be copied closely enough to fool an employer? What separated necessity from opportunism in a life shaped by want? The courts offered one set of answers. The newspapers offered another. Neither told the whole story. This book does not ask for her innocence. It does not attempt to smooth theft into romance, nor to mistake desperation for virtue. Goods were stolen. Employers were deceived. Trust was exploited. Those facts matter. But so do the conditions under which a poor young woman might find that male dress gave her access to work, movement, and wages otherwise denied to her. So does the world that taught her to read appearance as a system to be used. So does the family pressure that may have sat behind her choices, if the reports were true. So does the question of education, not only in the formal sense, but in the rough schooling of the street, the shop, the workshop, and the pawn counter. Lois Schwich was shaped by all of it. Her story belongs not only to the history of crime, but to the history of labor, gender, poverty, and urban survival. It is a story about what the city made possible for those willing to disguise themselves, and what it did to those who were caught. It is also a story about record and silence. The woman at its center survives in glimpses: a daughter, perhaps an elder sibling burdened with responsibility, a worker in borrowed clothes, a defendant in the dock, a newspaper curiosity, a name half preserved in print. The gaps around her are part of the story too. They speak to how easily the poor could vanish unless arrested, exposed, or punished. In the end, Lois Schwich entered the record because something went missing: cloth, clothing, property, confidence. But beneath that loss lay another, quieter one: the disappearance of the fuller self behind the case. What remains is enough to follow, though not enough to simplify. A girl becomes a boy. A worker becomes a suspect. A suspect becomes a headline. The city watches, judges, and moves on. Lois Schwich does not. She waits in the archive in fragments, still dressed for work. Chapter 1. London in disguise. In late Victorian London, clothing did not merely cover the body. It announced place, wages, respectability, and right of entry. A good coat could smooth suspicion. A cap set at the proper angle could make a youth seem employable, obedient, and known to the city. The century was obsessed with appearances, and the trade in dress had become one of its great public languages. Ready-made garments widened access to fashion, but they also sharpened the habit of reading class and character through cloth. In such a city, what a person wore could determine not only how they were judged, but whether they were allowed to work, to walk, to linger, or to be believed. London's West End gave this language one of its brightest stages. Oxford Street had long since become a thoroughfare of shops, traffic and display, while Burlington Arcade stood for something more polished and enclosed. Luxury, controlled movement, the sale of fine goods to those who expected order about them. These were not merely streets of commerce. They were theaters of trust. Parcels moved from hand to hand. Customers relied on appearances. Employers judged quickly. Boys were sent in and out on business. Men watched stock, but not always closely enough. The city ran on small acts of assumption. Among the most useful figures in that world was the errand boy. He was expected to be quick, neat, forgettable, and reliable. He carried messages, delivered parcels, fetched goods, waited in doorways, and learned how business moved. He had access without status. He was lowly enough to be overlooked and useful enough to be trusted. Victorian social investigators recognized the danger built into the role. The shopkeeper's boy had the run of storerooms, counters, and tills, and few adults mistrusted a small, obedient lad. Temptation sat close to his labor. So did opportunity. It was into this city, and into this kind of work, that Lois Schwich stepped. The record does not preserve her in the way it preserves the wealthy. There are no family albums, no cache of letters, no school certificates laid neatly aside for future historians. What remains are newspaper reports, court coverage, and the later scholarship built from them. Those sources agree on only a limited core. In October 1886, Lois Schwich, sometimes rendered Schwick, appeared in London charged with theft while dressed in boys' clothing. She was said to be 21 years old and to have been wearing male attire since the age of 17. Beyond that, much of what survives comes filtered through pity, gossip, suspicion, and the moral appetite of the press. Even so, a rough family picture emerges. Lois was described as the support of her mother and younger brothers and sisters. One newspaper account said the household had been near starvation when she secured work in male dress. Another repeated the mother's statement that several children depended on Lois's earnings. The truth of every detail cannot now be proved, and Victorian newspapers often sharpened distress into spectacle. Yet poverty in such households was no invention. It was common, grinding, and close to ruin. A single week wage, an illness, the loss of a place, or the absence of a husband's income could tilt a family into desperation with remarkable speed. Her education is harder still to recover. Later reports, eager to make her story more romantic, described her as well-educated, but the phrase reads like journalistic embroidery rather than secure fact. What is more likely is something partial and interrupted. Victorian Britain had, by the 1870s and 1880s, a patchwork of ragged schools, church schools, parish schools, and board schools. Compulsory elementary education existed on paper, but access for poor children remained uneven, especially where hunger and household need pressed harder than lessons. Many children learned a little reading, some writing, and enough reckoning to be useful, then slipped quickly into labor. Whatever Lois's formal schooling had been, it is unlikely to have been extensive. What she plainly possessed was another education altogether. The ability to observe, imitate, answer promptly, and present herself convincingly in a world that inspected the surface before it troubled to look beneath. That education may have begun at home. A struggling household trained its children early in necessity. They learned who paid late, who drank, who borrowed, who found sharing work, who went to the parish, who wore boots beyond repair, who might be trusted with a coin, and who must not be asked twice. They learned when to speak respectfully and when to keep quiet. They learned the price of coal, bread, rent, and failure. For a girl in such a home, prospects were narrow. Domestic service, casual labor, sewing, washing, minding children, shop work if one was lucky. Each demanded docility. None guaranteed security. Boys, though hardly protected from hardship, could move more freely through the public city. They delivered, carried, apprenticed, vanished into employment that began outside the home. The difference mattered. At some point before her arrest, Lois crossed that line. According to the account later repeated in the press, she had tried and failed to obtain employment as a girl. In desperation, and for the sake of her mother and the younger children, she put on boys' clothes and sought work under that appearance instead. Whether necessity alone drove the decision can no longer be known. A local clergyman later suggested the disguise had been sustained for years and was no sudden expedient. The newspapers seized on that contradiction. They preferred a simple moral shape. Either the dutiful daughter forced into disguise by want, or the practiced deceiver using hardship as cover. Life, as usual, was more difficult than the headline. What can be said with certainty is that the disguise worked. Lois presented herself at Messrs. Goodman and Davis, tailors in Oxford Street, and applied for a place as an errand boy. One report said she told Mr. Goodman she was 15 years old and had never been in a situation before. He believed her. She was taken on. The detail is easily passed over, but it contains the heart of the matter. She was not simply wearing male clothing in private or in rebellion. She was using it as documentary proof, without paper. In the absence of references, certificates, or any other formal credential of worth, the cut of the clothes, the manner of the body within them, and the confidence of the performance were enough to open the door. There was nothing glamorous in such work. The romance was supplied later by the press. In reality, an errand boy's day was made up of repeated small obediences. Carrying parcels, waiting at counters, answering summons, moving goods between shop and customer, learning routes, remembering names, standing in sight yet scarcely in notice. But such a position offered something priceless to a person from a hard household. It offered regular movement through the city and regular proximity to goods. In a tailor's establishment, those goods were not abstract wealth but tangible, portable things. Lengths of cloth, cut pieces ready for garments, finished trousers, items already translated from fabric into value. A worker who knew where such things were kept knew where temptation lay. Goodman and Davis employed Lois for several months. During that period, articles began to go missing. The reports later named trousers and cloth already cut out for garments, with losses said to total between 60 and 80 pounds, a substantial sum. At first there was no immediate prosecution. Mr. Goodman dismissed the young employee he believed to be a boy. The matter might have ended there, filed away as one more loss absorbed by trade, had the pattern not resumed elsewhere. But even before the police entered fully into the story, the essential shape of Lois's life was visible. Work obtained through disguise, access earned through trust, and trust bent towards theft. From Oxford Street, she moved on to Burlington Arcade, into the service of Frederick Noble Jones, a glover. The change in setting mattered. Burlington Arcade was more exclusive, more polished, a passage designed for genteel consumption and guarded order. To work there as a porter was to move within a more refined economy of display, where gloves, handkerchiefs, and other small luxuries carried high value in little space. Again Lois was believed to be male. Again she worked for some months. Again goods began to disappear. This time the losses were noticed and acted upon more sharply. Jones handed the porter to the police, and with that handover the private problem of a missing stockroom became a public case. Only then did the city discover what it most wanted to talk about. Not the vanished cloth. Not the habits of employers who trusted appearances because trade demanded speed. Not the poverty of the family said to have depended upon these wages. It was the body beneath the clothing that excited London. Once Lois's sex was known, the thefts became inseparable from the disguise. The newspapers rushed in. A thief would have filled a column. A female errand boy could fill many more. Public sympathy flared almost at once, fed by the image of a young woman sacrificing respectability to save her starving family. Donations were offered. Admirers appeared. There was talk of innocence, of misfortune, of romance. That mood would not last. But it tells much about the city that pity arrived first through sensation. It also tells much about the world Lois had learned to navigate. Victorian London believed fiercely in visible distinctions between male and female, respectable and criminal, worker and imposter. Yet those distinctions could be crossed with alarming ease when a person understood how to wear them. A poor young woman, shut out from certain kinds of employment, had managed to pass as a boy in 2 separate businesses and to remain there for months. Whatever else she was observant. She had learned posture, speech, pace, and silence. She had made herself legible to employers in the one language they trusted at speed: appearance. By the time her name entered the newspapers, the city had already educated her in its harshest lessons. It had shown her that labor might be found where honesty could not. It had shown her that some garments granted freedom of movement denied to others. It had shown her that poverty narrowed virtue into a luxury many could not afford to keep intact. Whether Lois first put on boys' clothes from desperation, ambition, concealment, habit, or some deeper and more private necessity may never be known. The archive is too thin, the voices around her too interested in using her for their own ends. But the result is plain enough. She stepped into London dressed for work, and London believed her. The thefts would bring judgment. The newspapers would bring spectacle. The court would do what courts did. But before any of that, there was a household under pressure, a young woman with uncertain schooling, a city that read character through clothes, and a door that opened only when she knocked as someone else. Chapter 2. The girl who became a boy. Before she became a case, she was part of a household. That fact sits beneath everything else, even when the surviving record struggles to hold it steady. By the time Lois Schwich entered the newspapers, she had already been stripped down to the elements the public found most useful: theft, disguise, novelty, moral danger. The details of her earlier life were not preserved with care. They appeared only in fragments, gathered at speed and filtered through reporters, police, courtroom exchanges, and the passing remarks of those who claimed to know her. Even so, the outline is enough to suggest the shape of the pressure under which she lived. She came from the working poor. That much is plain. In late 19th century London, poverty was not a dramatic interruption to ordinary life. For many families it was ordinary life. Rooms were crowded, bedding was shared, meals were stretched, work was uncertain. Girls and boys grew up learning that income, however small, was not a private possession but part of the household machinery. A child who earned contributed. An older daughter, especially, could become a second mother in all but name, carrying younger children, managing small domestic tasks, and helping to hold together whatever remained after wages, rent, and debt had taken their share. Lois was described as helping to support her mother and younger siblings. The claim may have been simplified for the press, but it rings true within the world from which she came. Families in such circumstances depended on every available hand. If a father had died, deserted, drunk away wages, or simply ceased to be useful to the household economy, the burden shifted at once onto the women and older children. Illness could do the same. One lost wage might mean the pawning of clothes. 2 lost wages might mean eviction, hunger, the workhouse, or some scramble for survival that respectable society preferred not to see too closely. There was little romance in this kind of duty. It made people practical before it made them old. Whatever Lois's exact family circumstances had been, she seems to have grown up in a world where dependence was immediate and visible. Poor households did not have the luxury of abstraction. They knew the price of bread because they had to. They knew the cost of coal because coal entered the room when coal was lacking. They knew how long a pair of boots could be made to last, how much a shawl might fetch in pawn, which shopkeeper would extend credit, and which landlord would not. This was an education of its own, and often a harder one than anything learned in school. Formal schooling, where it existed, competed with necessity. Britain had extended elementary education in the second half of the century, but attendance among the poor was often irregular. Children missed lessons to mind younger siblings, carry food, queue for errands, help with washing, or earn pennies where they could. Many learned enough reading to decipher signs, newspapers, or labels, enough writing to scratch a name, enough arithmetic to count coins and avoid being too easily cheated. More than that could not always be spared. It is impossible to say with certainty how far Lois's schooling went. Some accounts later called her well-educated, though such descriptions may have reflected surprise at her manner rather than fact. She may have been literate. She may have had some schooling beyond the minimum. But whatever classroom instruction she received, it was not the only, nor perhaps the most useful, education she had. The city taught her too. It taught her how people looked at one another and what they expected to see. It taught her the difference between the gaze cast upon a girl and that cast upon a boy. It taught her which bodies were challenged, which were ignored, and which were waved through because they appeared to belong to the ordinary business of the day. It taught her that labor was divided by sex as sharply as by class, and that the division was defended as natural even when it produced hardship. A girl might wash, scrub, sew, serve, mind children, carry parcels in a shop under watchful supervision, or enter domestic service if she could obtain a reference. A boy, by contrast, might move through the public city, fetch, deliver, apprentice, porter, carry, call, wait, enter warehouses and workshops, stand in arcades, and travel on his employer's business with a freedom so routine it passed unnoticed. Such freedoms were small by the standards of the wealthy, but to the poor they mattered immensely. For a young woman shut out from dependable work, the advantages of being taken for a boy were obvious. There were wages to be had. There was movement. There was less scrutiny. There was, above all, employability. A respectable shopkeeper might hesitate over a girl for reasons of propriety, practicality, or mere habit, but think nothing of hiring a boy to run errands. The difference between exclusion and opportunity could be no more than a collar, a jacket, a haircut, a cap, a certain style of speech, and the confidence to sustain the part. At some point in her late teens, Lois made that crossing. The decision has often been presented as if it occurred in a single dramatic moment. A desperate daughter, a hungry household, a change of clothes, a step out into the city remade. Real life is seldom so neat. More likely it was an adjustment arrived at under pressure and then repeated until it became a mode of living. She may first have worn male attire only for work. She may have extended the disguise gradually as it proved successful. She may have found that once one employer accepted her as a boy, the fiction became easier to continue than to abandon. Each day it worked became an argument for the next. Each successful encounter deepened the habit. A disguise sustained for months, then years, demanded discipline. It required more than clothing. Clothes were only the outer shell of credibility. Beneath them had to be posture, movement, voice, restraint, and vigilance. A young working-class woman presenting as male in Victorian London had to learn how to occupy space differently. She had to know when to speak and when not to speak, how to answer questions without inviting more, how to move through male workplaces without revealing uncertainty, and how to withstand close scrutiny without flinching into self-consciousness. She had to become ordinary in a specific way. That ordinariness was the real achievement. The Victorian city was full of performance, though it disliked calling it that. Respectability itself was a performance, maintained through linen, manners, punctuality, tone, and the management of appearances. Shopkeepers performed reliability. Servants performed deference. Clerks performed diligence. Boys performed usefulness. Women performed modesty. Men performed authority. What made Lois disturbing to those who learned of her case was not simply that she had dressed as a boy, but that she had apparently understood how much of social life already rested on rehearsed surfaces. She had learned the script and passed. Whether she felt fear, exhilaration, shame, or relief in those first experiments with male dress cannot now be known. The archive is full of accusation and interpretation, but empty of interiority. No diary survives to say what she thought when she first walked into the street dressed not as a daughter or a girl, but as a lad in search of employment. Yet one thing can safely be assumed. The disguise must have answered some urgent need. No poor woman lightly chose a path that invited exposure, scandal, and punishment. Whatever else the clothing did, it solved a problem. It made her legible to employers in a way her female self perhaps had not been. To dress as a boy was also to enter another chronology. Girlhood in poor households was often brief. It was overtaken by service, care work, exhaustion, and worry. Boyhood, by contrast, could stretch into a visible apprenticeship to public labor. The errand boy was untidy, lowly, and at the mercy of his superiors, but he was nonetheless recognized as a participant in the wider machinery of business. He belonged to the street. He was expected there. For Lois, to present as male may have meant not only access to wages, but access to a life conducted outside the narrow rooms of domestic dependence. Even so, the transformation should not be misunderstood as freedom in any simple sense. It was another form of labor. Every disguise creates work for the person inside it. There is the strain of maintenance, the constant correction of gesture and speech, the watch kept over one's own body, the fear of interruption, the need to invent when questioned, the anxiety of illness, exposure, or accident. A poor person working long hours under such conditions had little room for error. Fatigue alone could betray them. An employer's curiosity could do the same. So could a change of lodging, a police inquiry, a doctor, a former acquaintance, or the casual cruelty of anyone who found entertainment in unmasking another's vulnerability. Yet Lois persisted. That persistence suggests both necessity and aptitude. By the time she came before employers, she had already become convincing enough to pass initial inspection. She was believed when she presented herself as younger than she was. She was believed when she claimed inexperience. She was believed when she entered commercial spaces not built for women in her position. These were not miracles. They were the results of study and nerve. She had grasped something essential about the society around her. That many people do not examine what seems to fit the pattern they already expect. This, too, was a kind of intelligence. The press, when it later discovered her, struggled with the implications. Some reports tried to recover her as a dutiful daughter, making her almost sentimental, a child of poverty sacrificing femininity for filial duty. Others recoiled from that tenderness and cast her instead as a practiced deceiver. Both versions were too convenient. The first softened crime into melodrama. The second erased the conditions that had made the disguise useful, perhaps necessary, in the first place. Between them lies a more difficult possibility. That Lois was both constrained and calculating, both dutiful and self-interested, both shaped by want and willing to exploit what she learned from it. That is often the truth of working-class crime. It emerges not from pure innocence or pure villainy, but from a landscape in which survival, ambition, shame, resentment, and opportunity meet in unstable proportions. If Lois's home life trained her in responsibility, it may also have trained her in concealment. Poor families learn to keep certain things from public view. They hid arrears from landlords as long as possible, hunger from neighbors when pride demanded it, bruises beneath sleeves, children from school officers, possessions from pawnbrokers until there was no alternative, and domestic failures from the moral eye of the parish. To manage poverty was often to manage what others could see of it. A girl growing up amid such pressures would become highly alert to the uses of presentation. Respectability, however fragile, was itself a disguise worn against humiliation. Male attire, in that sense, may have been an extension rather than a rupture. It was another way of arranging the surface to secure a chance. Family history in cases like hers tends to vanish just where it becomes most interesting. One longs to know the mother more clearly, her health, her work, her habits, whether she approved of the disguise, resisted it, or simply accepted the wages it produced. One wants to know the younger children, if younger children there were, and whether they admired Lois, depended upon her, or were too small to understand the nature of her transformation. One wants to know whether neighbors suspected, whether lodgings were shared, whether anyone addressed her by one name indoors and another in the street. But the record, as so often with the poor, offers no settled answer. The family appears only as a necessity in the background, summoned when useful to explain conduct, and then allowed to disappear again. So Lois herself must carry the chapter. Before the thefts and the court, before the headlines and the sentence, there was a young woman who had learned that she could remake her chances by remaking her appearance. That lesson did not erase poverty. It did not dissolve responsibility. It did not make her safe. But it altered the map of possibility. The city that might have closed its doors to her as a girl opened them, cautiously but sufficiently, to her as a boy. Work came into reach. Trust came into reach. Access came into reach. And with access came temptation. It is possible that theft entered the story only later, after the disguise had already proven itself. It is possible, equally, that the prospect of theft was bound up with the disguise from the start, that the point of becoming employable was not only wages but proximity to goods that might be converted into money. The surviving evidence cannot fully resolve the sequence of intention. It can only show the convergence. A poor young woman with a practiced disguise, uncertain schooling, family responsibilities, and increasing familiarity with the clothing trade had placed herself in a position where honesty and dishonesty stood side by side. The same skills that allowed her to secure work allowed her to exploit it. By then she had already crossed the threshold from one social identity into another. There would be no easy return to innocence, if innocence had ever existed in the form the newspapers liked to imagine. There was only the continuation of the role, the maintenance of appearances, and the riskier world that opened once appearances began to pay. In later retellings, the novelty of Lois Schwich's male presentation would often overshadow the harder, quieter truth of her life, that she had come from a household where labor was a necessity, not a virtue, that education, if she received it, had been partial, that gender shaped not only how she was seen but what work she could hope to obtain, and that disguise, far from being a carnival trick, may have been the most practical instrument available to her. None of this excuses what followed. But without it, the story shrinks into something false and shallow. She did not begin as a headline. She began, as many did, in want. And from want she fashioned a boy's appearance, a worker's manner, and a place for herself in the moving commercial life of London. It was an act of ingenuity. It was an act of concealment. It was the beginning of employment, and the beginning of deception. By the time the city noticed her, those things could no longer be separated. The world she entered next would test how far the disguise could carry her. Oxford Street was waiting. Chapter 3. Goodman and Davis. Oxford Street was one of the great public corridors of London, a place where labor, spectacle, and commerce met in restless succession. By the 1880s, it was already crowded with shops, traffic, delivery carts, clerks, apprentices, servants, hawkers, shoppers, idlers, and the endless movement of goods from back room to counter, from counter to parcel, from parcel to hand. It was a street built on display, but display alone did not keep it alive. Beneath the polished fronts and persuasive window arrangements lay a harder, more practical system of work. Stock to be counted, cloth to be cut, orders to be packed, accounts to be kept, messages to be sent, and young employees to be directed from one task to the next. A business survived not on elegance but on routine. Into that routine Lois Schwich entered as an errand boy. The surviving record offers only a narrow glimpse of her arrival, but the essentials are clear enough. She presented herself to Messrs. Goodman and Davis, tailors in Oxford Street, claimed to be younger than she was, and obtained employment. It was the sort of success that would have seemed small to anyone above her station and enormous to anyone within it. To secure a place in a respectable business was to secure, at least temporarily, the right to eat, to contribute something at home, and to remain outside the worst forms of destitution. The wage may not have been large, but regularity had its own value. So did respectability, even borrowed respectability, even respectability founded on a deception that might at any moment fail. The work itself was likely tedious, repetitive, and physically wearing. Errand boys did not inhabit the glamorous margins of commerce. They served its most ordinary needs. They waited for instructions, fetched parcels, carried messages, delivered garments, ran between suppliers and customers, and made themselves useful in whatever manner the business required. Their labor was often invisible precisely because it was everywhere. They were expected to appear quickly when called and disappear again when the task was done. They belonged to the machinery of the shop but not to its authority. Their usefulness lay in their mobility and their obscurity. For Lois, that obscurity was an asset. A young worker placed in such a role had access, without prominence. She could move between rooms, handle packages, see how goods were stored, learn who watched carefully and who did not, and observe which materials carried the greatest value in the smallest size. A tailor's business was especially vulnerable in this respect. Cloth, once cut, became harder to trace. A finished garment might be identified, but lengths of fabric, trimmings, unfinished pieces, and work in progress could pass quickly into other hands. A pair of trousers, a cut length of cloth, a finished article removed at the right time and in the right way might vanish into the city almost as though it had never existed. The clothing trade invited both skill and temptation. It dealt in portable value. It relied on order, but order was maintained by people, and people were prone to habit, distraction, and assumption. A busy shop could not halt itself for suspicion at every turn. Employers depended upon quick judgments. Once a young worker had been accepted, he was often folded into the pattern of the day with less scrutiny than might later seem wise. So long as he turned up, answered promptly, and performed the expected motions of obedience, the appearance of reliability could sustain itself for some time. Lois appears to have understood this at once or learned it very quickly. What she made of her first days there cannot be known. The archive does not preserve the texture of her mornings, the cut of the coat she wore, the sound of her boots on the floorboards, the exact tone in which she answered Mr. Goodman, or the strain she may have felt in maintaining the disguise. Yet one may safely say that employment was itself a test. To present as a boy at the moment of hiring was one thing. To remain convincing through the long monotony of working life was another. It required consistency. The body must be managed. The voice must not wander. Familiarity must not produce carelessness. Fatigue must not undo what nerve had secured. And so she worked. There is something almost cruel in the contrast between the modest nature of the position and the scale of what later followed. The errand boy occupied one of the lowest rungs in the commercial order, yet from that low vantage point Lois gained entry into a system larger than herself. She was not a proprietor, not a cutter, not a clerk, not a trusted senior hand. She had no recognized trade and little power. But she occupied the very kind of position from which a person could learn the movements of goods better than many who outranked her. In trade, as in houses, those at the bottom often saw most. At some stage during her employment, items began to go missing. Here the surviving accounts take on the sharper lines of accusation. Trousers and cut pieces of cloth were later said to have disappeared while Lois was employed at Goodman and Davis. The sums attached to the losses were not trivial. They were large enough to cause concern, though not, at first, enough to produce immediate public scandal. In a busy establishment, losses might be explained away for a time by carelessness, miscounting, confusion over orders, or suspicion directed elsewhere. Employers did not always rush to prosecute. Sometimes they preferred dismissal. Sometimes they waited. Sometimes they lacked proof, and proof mattered. It is possible that the first disappearances were noticed only gradually. One garment unaccounted for might be blamed on confusion. A length of cloth missing from expected stock might be written off to error. But repetition creates shape. What can be ignored once becomes harder to ignore when it returns. Someone must have started noticing a pattern. Someone must have wondered whether the youthful employee so recently taken on was not merely inexperienced, but dangerous. Whether Lois stole cautiously at first, testing the opportunities around her, or whether the thefts were bolder from the outset, the record does not say. It is tempting to imagine a progression, curiosity hardening into method, necessity sharpening into confidence. Such a sequence would fit the logic of many theft cases, yet it cannot be proved in hers. What can be said is that the offenses later attributed to her were not the chaotic acts of a person wholly ignorant of value. They concerned goods that could be converted into money. They arose in a setting where access was structured by routine. They suggest observation, patience, and at least some sense of how stolen items might be moved on. This is where the household behind her story re-enters the room. If Lois was indeed helping to support her mother and younger siblings, then wages alone may have seemed insultingly small against the pressure of need. It is one thing to earn. It is another to earn enough. The poor were expected to honor property while often possessing almost none of their own. They were expected to keep faith with employers whose losses might amount to more than a laboring family saw in months. Victorian morality placed great weight on honesty, but honesty could be difficult to sustain where every calculation returned to want. This does not excuse theft. It does, however, explain the material logic under which theft could become thinkable. There may also have been another element at work: the exhilaration of success. A disguise that held, an employer deceived, trust obtained, goods removed without immediate detection. Such experiences can alter a person's sense of what is possible. The first successful theft does not merely produce money, it rearranges confidence. It teaches that systems presumed secure may in fact be porous. It teaches that those above can be fooled. It teaches that appearances, once mastered, can do more than gain employment. They can shield crime. Lois's position gave her more than access to goods. It gave her access to rhythms. She would have seen when work was busiest, when attention faltered, when deliveries came in, when completed garments sat awaiting collection, when errands provided cover for movement, and how long an item might remain unnoticed if removed at the right moment. Every workplace develops such vulnerabilities. Most employees never exploit them. Some do. A person already living inside an invented identity had, perhaps, crossed one moral line more easily than others. The step from false presentation to dishonest taking may not have felt as wide from within as it appears from outside. Still, There is danger in imagining her too competent too soon. She was young. However practiced her disguise, she was not yet untouchable. What she possessed was not mastery but nerve, and nerve is a resource that can produce success for a time while also hastening exposure. Every disappearance increased the risk. Every unexplained loss sharpened the chance that some overlooked detail would suddenly matter. A business may tolerate uncertainty, but no business tolerates repeated leakage indefinitely. At Goodman and Davis, that limit was reached without full resolution. Mr. Goodman did not at once drag the matter into open court. Instead, Lois was dismissed. Such a decision suggests uncertainty mixed with suspicion. Dismissal rid the shop of a troubling employee without requiring the employer to stake his case publicly before he was ready. It was the practical solution of a businessman who believed he had identified the likely source of his losses, but may not yet have possessed enough evidence, or enough appetite, for prosecution. The young errand boy was removed. The business continued. Trade demanded as much. For Lois, dismissal did not end the experiment. It merely interrupted one phase of it. That fact is crucial. Had the story concluded at Oxford Street, it might have disappeared almost entirely from the historical record. An employee suspected of dishonesty, sent away without public proceedings, would hardly have become a subject of fascination. What transformed this from a private employer's grievance into a memorable case was continuation. Lois did not return quietly to obscurity. She found work again. That she could do so is one of the clearest measures of how effective the disguise remained. Suspicion in one workplace had not yet traveled far enough to foreclose opportunity in another. London was large. Employers were busy. Information moved unevenly. A dismissed errand boy could become a porter elsewhere so long as the new employer saw only a decent appearance, a plausible manner, and a body that seemed to fit the role. The city size protected reinvention as much as it protected anonymity. But something had changed. By the time Lois left Goodman and Davis, she was no longer merely a young woman seeking work in borrowed form. She was a worker under suspicion. Whether that suspicion had frightened her, embittered her, or simply taught her to be more careful, one cannot know. Yet the pattern was set. Employment had provided access. Access had led to theft. Theft had led not to immediate ruin but to dismissal and a second chance elsewhere. That sequence may have appeared, from within her circumstances, less as a warning than as proof that the risk could be survived. If so, it was a dangerous lesson. Oxford Street had given her a beginning. It had shown her that male presentation could secure a place, that trust could be won, and that goods could be taken from within the ordinary conduct of trade. It had also shown her the first edge of consequence. She had been suspected. She had been removed. She had not yet been exposed to the full public violence of the courts or the press. But the ground beneath her was no longer stable. One more misstep, one more employer, one more series of losses, and the private deception of a shop would become something much larger. She left the tailor's establishment carrying more than whatever goods she may have stolen. She carried knowledge of stock, of routine, of employer habits, of her own powers, and of the city's willingness to believe what was dressed correctly. Such knowledge is a kind of capital. It can be used honestly or dishonestly, cautiously or recklessly. In Lois's case, it would be used again. The next setting was grander, narrower, more polished, and, in some ways, more dangerous. From Oxford Street, she moved towards Burlington Arcade, where finer goods sat behind finer glass, and where appearance mattered even more than before. Chapter 4. Theft in the Clothing Trade. A theft in the clothing trade was rarely just a theft. It was not merely a hand closing over property, or an article slipping from shelf to pocket, or a dishonest worker taking advantage of an inattentive employer. It was part of a larger circulation, one that connected workshop to shopfront to street, street to pawnshop, and pawnshop to the many quieter economies that flourished beneath respectable commerce. Cloth, once stolen, did not remain cloth for long. It became money, debt paid for another week, rent postponed, meals bought, boots mended, lodgings kept, or some brief illusion of safety purchased against a life that allowed very little of it. Victorian London was a city of goods in motion. Everything moved: fabric, garments, trimmings, gloves, hats, ribbons, household linen, remnants, ready-made suits, unfinished orders. parcels tied in string, and samples carried from one set of hands to another. The scale of the city made such movement necessary, but it also made loss almost inevitable. Items went missing in transit. Stock was miscounted. Employees pocketed what they thought would not be noticed. Customers concealed what they had not paid for. Suppliers cheated. Middlemen skimmed. In theory, the system rested on order. In practice, it survived a constant leakage that employers learned to fear but could never entirely prevent. The clothing trade was especially vulnerable because its goods were both valuable and manageable. A bolt of cloth could be divided. A finished garment could be worn, altered, sold, pawned, exchanged, or broken back down into use. A pair of trousers was not a piano or a sideboard. It did not need a cart and 3 men to remove it. It could disappear beneath an arm, under a coat, into a bundle, or out the back door under the pretense of an ordinary errand. Much of the trade's inventory was portable enough to tempt and common enough not to attract immediate notice. That was part of its danger. The city's moralists liked to imagine theft as a rupture, a descent from honesty into vice. The reality was often more gradual and more ordinary. In workshops and shops alike, employees handled goods all day long. They packed them, carried them, counted them, folded them, cut them, delivered them, and returned them. Familiarity dulled wonder. It also dulled, in some cases, restraint. A person who worked among cloth and garments every day might come to think of them not as distant luxuries, but as things within reach, things almost theirs through labor, if not through ownership. The line between handling and taking could narrow when wages were poor and need was close. For young workers, the temptation could be particularly sharp. Errand boys, apprentices, porters, and junior hands occupied a peculiar position. They were trusted just enough to be dangerous and supervised too unevenly to be safe. Employers expected them to move quickly, obey instructions, and remain useful. They could not be watched every minute. A business that attempted such vigilance would barely function. So the system relied on assumption that the low-paid young would value their positions enough to remain honest, that habit would produce reliability, and that fear of dismissal would do the rest. Often it did. Sometimes it did not. When it did not, the city had many ways of absorbing stolen goods. Pawnshops stood at the center of one of those systems. They were legal, visible, and indispensable to working-class life. Respectable society distrusted them, mocked them, and depended upon them all the same. For the poor, the pawnshop was not merely a place of vice. It was an institution of survival. Clothing, bedding, tools, jewelry, household items, children's boots, shawls, and coats moved in and out with the rhythm of wages. Goods were pledged on Monday and redeemed on Friday if possible, pledged again the following week if necessary. To pawn was often to manage poverty in installments. This made the pawnbroker both useful and suspect. Honest customers used him to endure bad weeks. Dishonest customers used him to convert theft into cash. The distinction was not always visible at the counter. A garment presented in decent condition by a person with a plausible manner might pass, without immediate alarm. Even where suspicion existed, proof lagged behind. London size protected both lawful distress and unlawful dealing. A stolen article might travel quickly enough that by the time an employer recognized its absence, it had already changed hands, been altered, or vanished into another district altogether. For a worker like Lois, if the accusations against her are taken as true, this wider economy mattered as much as the theft itself. To steal successfully from employers in the clothing trade required not only access to goods, but some means of turning them into value. That does not necessarily mean sophistication. One need not belong to an organized gang to understand that cloth could be sold, that garments could be pawned, or that certain items moved more easily than others. In a city where once sharpened observation, such knowledge circulated widely. The poor knew what could be turned into money because their lives depended upon knowing it. This was one reason employers feared internal theft so keenly. A stranger who broke in from outside carried a certain risk, but so too did the quiet, obedient worker already inside. The latter knew where stock was kept, which goods were worth taking, how often accounts were checked, which rooms were left unattended, and who among the staff was lax, vain, or easily distracted. He knew which parcel might leave the premises unquestioned. He knew whether a missing item would be noticed at once or only days later. Theft from within threatened not only the inventory, but the entire illusion of orderly trade. It also wounded pride. A respectable employer wanted to believe himself a competent judge of character. To be deceived by a worker, particularly a young and lowly one, was a humiliation as much as a loss. It suggested weakness in management, carelessness in supervision, and a dangerous gap between appearance and reality. Such humiliations help explain why theft cases so often acquired a moral tone beyond the value of the goods concerned. The offense was not only against property, it was against trust, hierarchy, and the employer's sense of mastery over his own premises. In Lois's case, the wound to trust was sharpened by disguise. If she had merely stolen, she might have been classed as one more dishonest employee in a city that produced many. But she had also obtained the work under false presentation. That fact transformed the meaning of the crime. It suggested not impulse alone but premeditation. Not simply temptation seized in a weak moment, but a prior willingness to deceive in order to secure access. Whether that interpretation was entirely fair is another question. A poor young woman seeking work in male dress may have done so first for employment rather than theft. But once the thefts were alleged, the disguise itself was pulled into the chain of guilt and made to seem part of the same design. The clothing trade, perhaps more than many others, intensified this reading because it was already preoccupied with surfaces. Tailors sold shape, fit, finish, and respectability. Glovers and haberdashers dealt in refinement, presentation, and the small details by which class announced itself. In such businesses, appearance was currency. To deceive by means of dress was to exploit the very language on which the trade depended. It was almost too apparent. A thief in another setting might have seemed merely dishonest. Here, the deception mirrored the commerce itself, and therefore seemed more intimate, more insolent, more threatening. Yet the trade also created the conditions that made such deceptions workable. It judged quickly. It relied heavily on routine. It accepted young workers into roles defined by movement rather than scrutiny. It placed valuable goods in environments of hurry and assumed that the familiar face in the correct attire was what it appeared to be. In that sense, theft in the clothing world was not an alien force invading honest commerce. It was one of the risks produced by commerce's own habits. Women, too, occupied a particular place within this economy, though not always openly. Much of the labor that sustained the trade was female. Sewing, finishing, mending, laundry work, pressing, trimming, folding, domestic needlework, and the long, poorly paid piecework carried out in lodgings and cramped rooms. Women handle garments constantly, often without gaining either security or public standing from that knowledge. They knew cloth by touch, cut, and wear. They knew quality, resale value, and which items pass most easily through second-hand channels. But the better paid, more mobile, more public roles often remained coded male. Boys ran errands. Porters carried goods. Clerks stood at counters. Apprentices entered trades more formally. Girls and women were expected to remain within narrower, more supervised forms of labor. For someone like Lois, male presentation did more than secure wages. It granted entry into the mobile side of the trade, the side where goods passed between spaces and could most easily go astray. That was one of the great practical differences between sewing in a room and moving through a business as an errand boy or porter. One handled goods under confinement, the other handled them in transit. Transit was opportunity, and opportunity, once recognized, can alter a life. There is no need to romanticize this. Theft in the trade had victims, and not all victims were wealthy men insulated from loss. Missing stock could affect wages, provoke suspicion among innocent employees, sour relations within a shop, or lead to dismissals that fell hardest on those least able to bear them. A dishonest worker did not strike at the system, in any pure or heroic sense. More often the blow traveled downward as well as up. One person's gain might become another's lost place or reduced trust. Crime in the commercial world was rarely tidy in its consequences. Still, the conditions that produced it cannot be ignored. The same city that condemned dishonesty trained people daily in calculation. It taught them that clothing was a form of value, that value could be moved, that want was relentless, and that respectability rested upon surfaces often thinner than advertised. A young woman who had already crossed the line into male employment had, by that act alone, shown herself willing to use the city's logic against itself. If she then turned to theft, she did so within a trade that made theft materially possible and socially legible. By the time Lois left Goodman and Davis, she had not merely worked in tailoring. She had received an education in the vulnerabilities of commerce. She had seen how goods were stored and moved, how suspicion rose slowly, how employers balanced inconvenience against certainty, and how long a dishonest worker might survive before proof hardened into action. She had also, almost certainly, learned something about aftermarkets. Where goods might be taken, how quickly they must be shifted, which articles drew less attention, and how small thefts could be hidden within the larger blur of business. These lessons would matter. Oxford Street had been a beginning, but not an end. The city's clothing trade extended well beyond one establishment, and so did the possibilities it offered. A person dismissed from a tailor's shop might still find work elsewhere if the appearance held and references were not pressed too hard. London did not always join its fragments neatly. One employer's suspicion could remain just that, private and incomplete, while another employer, in another district or another branch of the trade, started afresh with the same face and the same mistake. That was the weakness of a city built on speed. It forgot too easily. Lois moved on carrying the habits of the trade with her. How to look useful, how to remain unremarkable, how to touch goods as though they belonged in her hands, and how to pass through commercial spaces without inviting close examination. In another world, such skills might have made a respectable career. In hers, they had already begun to converge with dishonesty. The result was not yet a scandal, not yet a cautionary tale for the newspapers, not yet the full spectacle the public would eventually consume. It was, for the moment, only a pattern repeating itself, and repetition was what would undo her. Chapter 5. A new position, the same pattern. Dismissal did not end the matter. It merely drove it elsewhere. That, more than anything, reveals the confidence Lois had begun to acquire. Suspicion at Goodman and Davis had not broken the disguise. It had not forced confession, retreat, or a return to the narrower forms of labor expected of a poor woman. Instead, she resumed the performance and carried it into another branch of the trade. Whether this was boldness, desperation, or the simple lack of any safer alternative is impossible to say with certainty. Most likely it was some difficult mixture of all three. But the practical fact remains, after one place was lost, another was found. She moved from the tailor's world into Burlington Arcade. If Oxford Street was public commerce in full flow, Burlington Arcade was a more controlled expression of the same impulse. It offered elegance where Oxford Street offered bustle, refinement where the larger thoroughfare tolerated noise and strain. Its enclosed passage, polished fronts, and carefully ordered display projected a sense of managed luxury. Customers came not merely to buy, but to buy under conditions that affirmed taste, gentility, and calm. The goods were finer. The manner expected of those who served around them was finer too. Even the architecture suggested that trade here ought to be protected from the coarser forms of the city pressing in beyond its bounds. Yet goods were still goods, and people were still people. Behind polish lay stock. Behind the promise of refinement lay counting, carrying, storing, unpacking, wrapping, and watching. The commercial life of the arcade may have appeared more delicate than that of Oxford Street, but it rested on the same practical foundations. Items had to move from one set of hands to another. Someone fetched. Someone delivered. Someone kept track. Someone failed to do so perfectly. Wherever valuable things circulate, risk circulates with them. It was in this more select setting that Lois found work with Frederick Noble Jones, a glover. The change in occupation was not a dramatic one in terms of class. She had not ascended into comfort. She remained a low-paid worker in borrowed identity, dependent upon the continued success of her presentation. But the environment was different enough to matter. Gloves were not lengths of cloth or workaday garments in the same sense as trousers. They occupied a more intimate place in the culture of respectability. They were articles of appearance, small enough to be portable and desirable enough to carry value disproportionate to their size. A good glove moved easily through fashionable society, and therefore easily through theft as well. Luxury in small form invites a particular sort of dishonesty. It is simple to conceal and simple to convert. Again, Lois was believed. This is one of the most striking things about the whole case. Whatever doubts may later have been cast upon her story, Whatever suspicions were directed backward once she stood accused. She plainly possessed the ability to persuade employers at first meeting. Burlington Arcade did not employ merely any ragged youth drifting in from the street. To work there, even in a humble capacity, required a sufficient appearance of neatness, usefulness, and social acceptability. Lois must have understood by then how to pitch herself. Not too confident, not too hesitant, young enough to seem subordinate, brisk enough to seem employable, ordinary enough to disappear into the routine of the business. That was the art she had perfected. Not display, but ordinariness. As a porter, she would again have occupied one of those roles that stand slightly apart from the center of authority while moving constantly through its edges. A porter was useful because he carried, fetched, conveyed, and made possible the orderly operation of more visible commerce. Such work could seem almost mechanical to those above it. That was part of its power. A worker whose very purpose was movement could go in and out with less scrutiny than someone expected to remain fixed behind a counter. He belonged to the practical underlife of trade. He handled what others sold. This position also widened Lois's knowledge. By the time she entered Jones's service, she was no longer new to the commercial uses of disguise. She had already tested how male presentation could win trust, how a business absorbed a junior employee into routine, and how missing goods might initially pass without decisive action. Even if the Burlington position was honestly sought at first, it did not begin from innocence. It began from experience. She had learned what kind of worker employers expected to see, and she knew by then what access might provide. Once again, goods began to disappear. The pattern is both simple and revealing. New place, new trust, new losses. This repetition matters because it shifts the story away from the possibility of a single lapse. One dishonest act in one workplace can sometimes be read as sudden temptation, panic, or need overcoming restraint in a specific moment. But the recurrence of the same shape in a second setting suggests something steadier, method, or at least habit. Whatever hesitation may once have existed had, by this stage, weakened considerably. Lois did not merely encounter opportunity. She appears to have recognized it and acted upon it more than once. The exact rhythm of those thefts cannot now be recovered. One would like to know whether they were frequent or carefully spaced, whether small at first and bolder later, whether driven by immediate need or by a growing confidence that the system could once more be used against itself. The record supplies accusation, not tempo, yet the available outline suggests enough. The disappearances were substantial enough to attract notice and serious enough to provoke intervention. Burlington Arcade, for all its polished surface, was not blind. Goods had value, and value once lost called forth inquiry. There is something almost fatal in this second repetition. It is as if Lois, having learned the logic of the trade, trusted it a little too much. London's vastness could protect reinvention, but not indefinitely. Every new employer extended opportunity, yet every new employer also increased the chances that suspicion, once local, might harden into evidence. If Oxford Street had offered a warning without exposure, Burlington Arcade would not be so lenient. The very refinement of the place made dishonesty more scandalous. A loss from such premises was not merely inconvenient. It was an intrusion upon the self-image of order the arcade sold to its patrons. By this point, too, the stakes had altered in another way. At Goodman and Davis, suspicion seems to have resulted in dismissal. At Jones's establishment, the matter moved more decisively towards the police. That difference tells its own story. Whether because the evidence was stronger, the losses clearer, or the employer less inclined to absorb the insult privately, the second workplace did not let the pattern pass quietly. The young porter was no longer simply sent away. Authority closed in. What transformed suspicion into action was not only missing goods, but proof. Victorian commerce could survive uncertainty. It could survive even a certain amount of petty leakage. What it sought, when losses became intolerable, was something material, a trace, an article recovered, a witness, a contradiction, or that most banal and devastating of documents, the pawn ticket. Here the quiet intelligence of theft met the quiet bureaucracy of detection. The same urban systems that allowed stolen goods to be turned into money also created records of transaction. Those records were not perfect, but they could betray. What had seemed cleverly removed from a shop might reappear in a pawnbroker's book, connected by handwriting, date, and amount to the person who sought quick cash from portable goods. Once the police entered, the story began to change its nature. It was no longer a matter between employer and worker. It became a matter for public judgment. Yet even at this stage, before the newspapers had fully made their feast of the case, one can see the harsher truth beneath the coming sensation. Lois's second position exposed the limit of disguise as a strategy. It could gain access. It could perhaps even delay suspicion. But it could not control what happened once institutions set about uncovering facts. The same city that permitted a person to reinvent herself could, when offended, strip that invention away with astonishing speed. And still, the disguise had carried her far. This should not be forgotten merely because it ended badly. For months, perhaps years, Lois had navigated spaces, roles, and expectations closed to most women of her class. She had entered the masculine side of commercial labor and remained there long enough to earn wages, move among employers, and handle valuable goods. That was no small feat. It demanded observation, nerve, and persistence. It also demanded a tolerance for strain that must have been exhausting. To live in such sustained performance while under the pressures of poverty and possible criminality alike was a burden in itself. However the case is judged, the labor of maintaining the role was real. But a role, once used twice for the same purpose, starts to become a system. That is what gives Burlington Arcade its place in her story. It was not merely another job. It was confirmation. Whether she understood it fully or not, Lois had by then made a method of crossing from want into access, and from access into theft. The second position repeated the first with greater risk and, ultimately, greater consequence. It sharpened the meaning of everything that had come before. What might once have been defended as necessity now looked, in the eyes of law and public morality, more like pattern. Employers may forgive hunger more readily than repetition. Courts are less generous still. The nature of the goods mattered as well. In a tailor's establishment, missing cloth and garments could still be imagined as losses within the confusion of trade. In a glover's business in Burlington Arcade, where stock was smaller, finer, and more closely associated with genteel consumption, theft seemed more pointed, more intrusive. Gloves were worn at close quarters. They touched skin. They belonged to the rituals of public respectability. To steal them was not merely to remove merchandise. It was to interrupt a certain image of social order. Such symbolism may sound excessive, but Victorian society was built on symbols, and commerce in places like the arcade depended upon them. By the time Jones handed the case to the police, the private world Lois had constructed around herself had already begun to collapse. Once officials investigated, the question was no longer only what had been taken, but who she was. And in that inquiry lay the seed of the scandal to come. A dishonest porter could be managed. A young woman discovered in male dress after repeated thefts from respectable employers could not be so easily contained. The public would want to stare. The newspapers would want to interpret. Sympathy, curiosity, and disgust would soon gather around her in unstable proportion. But before the city turned her into a spectacle, she stood in a simpler and harsher position, accused, vulnerable, and at the edge of exposure. Burlington Arcade had given her another chance to pass, another set of goods to handle, another opportunity to trust in the city's willingness to accept appearances. It had also brought her to the threshold beyond which appearances could no longer protect her. What had once seemed a clever adaptation to poverty had become entangled beyond separation with deceit. What had once opened doors now threatened to close every door at once. The pattern had repeated itself. That was its strength. It was also its undoing. The next thing to vanish would not be stock. It would be the fragile privacy of Lois Schwich's invented life. Chapter 6. Pawn tickets. The city had many ways of swallowing stolen goods, but it also had ways of remembering them. This was the weakness in almost every modest theft. A garment taken from a shop did not become money by magic. It had to pass through hands, across counters, into records, or into rooms where someone else might later recognize it. The poor lived close to these systems and understood them intimately. They knew which goods would fetch something, which would fetch very little, and which were too distinctive to move without danger. They knew the value of a coat in winter, the value of linen in hardship, the value of a respectable pair of boots to a person who needed to appear employable. They also knew the value of speed. A stolen item held too long might become a liability. Moved quickly, it became survival. For that reason, the path from theft to pawnshop was one of the oldest and most ordinary in the city. There was nothing theatrical about a pawn ticket. It was a scrap of paper, a record of exchange, a token of temporary surrender. Yet in the history of petty crime it appears again and again as the small bureaucratic object that ruins larger pretense. The very institution that allowed the poor to endure bad weeks also kept a trail. Names might be false. Details might be vague. Goods might change shape between theft and pledge. But paper remained paper. Dates were entered. Items were described. Money passed. In a city of unreliable people, the record itself could become the most loyal witness. By the time the police turned their attention fully towards Lois, they were no longer dealing with mere suspicion. The second employer had not simply lost patience. He had moved beyond it. Articles had gone missing and the pattern was too familiar to ignore. Somewhere between the shop, the street, and the ordinary circuits of resale, enough substance had gathered to make the case worth pursuing. The private dishonesty of a junior worker was becoming public evidence. That evidence did not emerge all at once. Cases like this rarely unfolded in dramatic revelation. They were assembled bit by bit from articles unaccounted for, statements given, recollections sharpened after the fact, and the patient linking of missing goods to places where missing goods often reappeared. The process was humiliating in its own way, less like a duel than a gradual stripping back of excuses. A suspected employee might still maintain innocence while nothing concrete stood against him. Once articles were traced and records recovered, innocence narrowed rapidly. If Lois had previously lived by controlling appearances, the pawn system was an enemy precisely because it cared less for appearance than for transaction. At the counter a person might pass. On the page, things hardened. One can imagine the scene in its most ordinary form. A young worker, dressed respectably enough, presents an item or bundle to be pledged. The pawnbroker examines it with the practiced indifference of a man who has seen every grade of need and every shade of dishonesty. Value is named. A sum is offered. The goods pass over. A ticket is issued. No sermon follows. The counter is not a confessional. It is a business. Yet hidden within that banal exchange lies a moment of peril. What the customer experiences as conversion, the system preserves as trace. That trace now began to matter. The police, once involved, did what police and complainants in such cases were compelled to do. They looked for the route by which the goods had been turned into money. Stolen cloth did not announce itself loudly, but finished items, smaller luxury goods and pieces associated with known losses could, with effort, be matched. A glove was a glove only until its timing, quantity, or description aligned too neatly with what had vanished. A garment remained generic until someone remembered its cut, fabric, or provenance. Employers who had once dismissed uncertainty as inconvenience became surprisingly precise once the prospect of recovery appeared. There is a bleak irony in this. The poor often found themselves reduced to paperwork only when they had failed. Their hunger did not produce a record worth preserving. Their labor barely did. Their respectability, unless tied to property, seldom did. But once a theft was alleged, the machinery of note-keeping woke around them. The city that scarcely recorded their endurance became diligent in recording their offense. For Lois, this was the stage at which improvisation gave way to entrapment. A disguise can answer a question asked to the face. It cannot easily answer one asked by accumulated paperwork. The smartness of presentation, the careful posture, the little adjustments of voice and manner that had secured employment all lost force against a chain of records. One pawnbroker's recollection might be uncertain. Several linked details were less so. A denied accusation might still stand while no goods were produced. Recovered items shifted the ground. The city, which had allowed her to become ordinary in one set of clothes, now began to insist that ordinary people leave marks behind them even when they believed they had acted unnoticed. The importance of pawn tickets in such a case goes beyond simple detection. They reveal the economy in which the theft belonged. Lois was not accused of stealing objects with sentimental or symbolic value alone. She was accused of taking things that could be turned into cash. This placed her squarely within the practical world of working-class crime, where goods were judged first by portability, salability, and immediate usefulness. Such crime was rarely grand. It was transactional, It lived close to wages, rent, and debt. It was calculated not in fantasies of wealth, but in the arithmetic of shortfall. This is what made it so common and so hated. Respectable society could tell itself flattering stories about the criminal mastermind, the professional burglar, the gang leader, the monstrous deviant. It was less comfortable with the fact that much urban theft arose from the same streets, shops, and domestic pressures that respectable commerce relied upon. The thief might be a servant, a porter, an errand boy, a seamstress, a widow, an apprentice. He or she might look very much like the honest poor because the difference was often not visible until after the fact. That uncertainty unsettled employers more than overt villainy ever could. It suggested that the city produced dishonesty from within the very labor it demanded. The recovered trail also had another effect. It changed the moral temperature of the story. So long as Lois could be imagined as merely unusual, there remained room for indulgence. A young woman in boy's clothing, seeking work to support her family, had the makings of sensation softened by pity. But once goods and records entered the case more firmly, sentiment soured. Pity is easiest when suffering appears passive. It grows less generous when the sufferer is shown to have acted repeatedly and to have profited, however modestly, from deceit. The pawn ticket, in that sense, did more than help prove theft. It helped convert public curiosity into moral judgment. There was no nobility in the paper trail. It was plain, mean, practical, and fatal. One can only guess what Lois felt as the evidence tightened. Perhaps she still believed the case could be denied. Perhaps she hoped that the disguise, having protected her so long, would somehow continue to cloud the issue. Perhaps she was already exhausted by the strain of sustaining two lives at once, and sensed the end before it formally arrived. The archive does not give her those inward moments. It gives instead the colder sequence of accusation, tracing, recovery, and arrest. That is the brutality of historical record. It preserves the mechanics of collapse better than the human experience of it. Yet collapse there was. The movement from suspicion to arrest depends upon a threshold. At first an employer thinks goods are missing. Then he suspects a person. Then he seeks confirmation. Then the police intervene. Then some piece of material proof shifts the matter from private grievance into prosecutable offense. In Lois's case, the existence of pawned items and the documents connected with them seem to have helped carry the matter across that threshold. What had once been uncertain became legible enough to act upon. The city now held her in a new way. Until this point, she had used London's scale to her advantage. She had moved within it, taken on another presentation, slipped into new employment, and relied on the fact that one corner of commercial life did not always speak promptly to another. That same scale now worked against her. Once the search for goods widened into the city's ordinary channels of resale, the multiplicity of places through which stolen property might travel became a map for investigation. The urban web that supports survival can also tighten like a net. And still, for all the practical importance of the pawn trail, it was not what would fascinate the public most. The newspapers would not feast on a ticket stub or an inventory note. They would feast on her. The records gave the case backbone, but sensation would provide its face. This is one of the sadder truths of Victorian publicity. Evidence mattered for conviction. Novelty mattered for appetite. A straightforward tale of a dishonest porter might occupy only so much space. A female porter in disguise, accused of repeated theft from respectable employers, could be made to carry all the anxieties the period wished to express about gender, labor, deception, and social disorder. The pawn tickets helped create the case. The public, however, wanted the spectacle. By then there was no turning back to anonymity. Once the police had traced enough, once the employers had aligned their complaints, once articles were connected to the person under suspicion, Lois's invented life ceased to be private strategy and became prosecutable deceit. The city no longer treated her as a worker whose honesty was in doubt. It treated her as someone to be unveiled. The word has a violence to it that suits the moment. Unveiling suggests exposure, but also possession. The right of others to strip away what has been concealed and claim a superior truth beneath it. In Lois's case, that truth would not be allowed to remain merely legal. It would be social, moral, and sensational all at once. The same world that had ignored her while she passed successfully as a boy was about to become deeply interested in declaring what she really was. But first came the practical step from inquiry to custody. The articles had been traced as far as they needed to be. The paperwork had done its work. The goods that had once moved quietly from employer to street and from street to pawn counter now traveled back in another form, as evidence. What had brought small sums in moments of immediate need or calculated gain now returned carrying a larger cost. A ticket issued casually across a counter became one more nail in the structure of accusation. This was the danger at the heart of all modest theft. It promised quick relief and left a lingering trail. Lois had made use of the city's informal knowledge. What could be taken, how it might be moved, where it could be turned into cash. Now the city answered with formal knowledge of its own. Names, dates, pledges, descriptions, statements. The two systems met, and the weaker one lost. By the time she stood under official scrutiny, the case was no longer about missing goods alone. It was about identity, about the breach of trust in two separate establishments, about the conversion of respectable employment into criminal opportunity, and about the unnerving fact that a young woman had moved through male commercial life without detection until theft brought the mask into dispute. The records had found her. The arrest would deliver her to the wider public. Chapter 7. Arrested as a Curiosity. Arrest did not simply bring Lois Schwich to a halt. It changed the kind of person she was allowed to be. Until then, however precariously, she had lived within the logic of working life. She had presented herself as useful, employable, and ordinary. Even when theft entered the story, it did so first within the closed world of employers, stock, and suspicion. An employer might dismiss, accuse, or hand a worker to the police, but these were still acts within a practical system. They dealt with loss. They dealt with evidence. They dealt with the breach of trust as a matter requiring correction. Once Lois was arrested and her sex became public, something else took hold. She ceased to be merely a suspect in a theft case. She became an object. That transformation was immediate. The Victorian public had a broad appetite for crime, but not all crimes pleased it equally. Ordinary dishonesty could be consumed in small quantities. A servant who had pilfered plate, a pickpocket caught at a fair, a shop assistant who had taken from the till. Such cases fitted comfortably into familiar stories about vice, temptation, and punishment. Lois's case, by contrast, offered something more alluring. It presented theft wrapped inside disguise, poverty wrapped inside novelty, and a young woman whose movements through masculine commercial life could be displayed as both astonishing and improper. The facts of the alleged offenses mattered, but to the public they mattered less than the form in which those facts arrived. A female errand boy. A female porter, a young woman in boy's clothes. The phrase was enough to travel. Once the newspapers fastened onto it, the case expanded beyond its legal dimensions. What had been a matter of missing goods and pawned property now carried the larger burden of social meaning. Lois was made to stand for anxieties that exceeded her own life by far. She could be used to discuss the dangers of female deceit, the fragility of commercial trust, the peculiar miseries of poverty, the moral risks of the city, the instability of outward appearances, and the old fear that social boundaries were not nearly as secure as respectable people liked to imagine. The public, reading over breakfast or in the evening, did not merely learn of an arrest. It was invited to stare at a disturbance in the natural order. Such disturbances always attracted layers of feeling. There was curiosity first. Curiosity is often the most generous response the public offers to the poor because it costs nothing. It asks for no reform, no sacrifice, no serious thought, only attention sharpened by novelty. The image of Lois moving through London in male dress, obtaining work, deceiving employers, and only being exposed once theft brought official scrutiny was exactly the sort of story that could stir both fascination and self-satisfaction. Readers might marvel at her success, while quietly reassuring themselves that they, had they been there, would surely have seen through it. But curiosity alone could not sustain the story for long. It required moral coloring. So another layer emerged almost at once. Pity. Pity attached itself most easily to the account of family need. Here was the line that softened the edges of scandal. If Lois had worn male dress not for perversity or vanity, but to support her mother and younger siblings, then the case might be read, briefly, through the gentler lens of sacrifice. The newspapers, always alert to the emotional usefulness of domestic hardship, could cast her as a daughter driven by necessity into an unnatural but understandable expedient. Hunger, Filial duty and feminine self-denial had long proved effective ingredients in the manufacture of public sympathy. Added to the oddity of disguise, they gave the story a sentimental sheen. That sentiment had consequences. People offered assistance. Interest grew not only in the case, but in the person at its center, or rather in the version of her most convenient for public feeling. A poor young woman trying to feed a family while navigating a city that offered too little honest work to girls could be admired just enough to make the readers feel humane. The same society that had done little to relieve such poverty was capable, in the face of spectacle, of sudden emotional generosity. It is one of the more telling hypocrisies of the period. Suffering ignored in bulk could be cherished in miniature when attached to an arresting face and a novel story. Yet pity of this kind was always unstable. It depended on keeping the criminal aspect of the case in careful proportion. If hardship remained visible and guilt remained uncertain, compassion could flourish. If repeated theft, calculated deceit, and material evidence grew too substantial, the sentimental frame began to crack. The public liked a victim better than a strategist. It preferred necessity in the abstract to necessity translated into repeated dishonesty. In Lois's case, this tension was there from the beginning. Even as sympathy circulated, the harder facts of the accusation remained. Missing goods from more than one employer, articles traced into the circuits of pawn and resale, and a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as a single desperate act. Still, in the first flush of exposure, novelty held the stronger hand. Part of what unsettled observers was not simply that Lois had worn male clothing, but that she had done so successfully and in spaces considered securely masculine in their routine. She had not donned a theatrical costume for amusement or disguise in some fleeting emergency. She had worked. She had entered the practical world of commerce, where boys and men moved as part of the ordinary day. She had handled goods, answered employers, fulfilled duties, and remained accepted as what she appeared to be. This was far more disturbing than mere masquerade. It suggested competence. It suggested that the difference between the categories the period guarded so fiercely could, under certain conditions, be crossed with unnerving ease. That possibility excited and alarmed in equal measure. The Victorian world professed certainty about sex, role, and station. Men belonged here. Women belonged there. Boys might move through the public world an apprenticeship to manhood. Girls were to be guided towards service, domesticity, modest labor, and dependence. Such divisions were defended not only as custom but as nature. Lois's case did not overthrow those ideas, but it embarrassed them. If a poor young woman could present herself well enough to obtain employment as a boy from more than one respectable employer, then the supposedly obvious signs upon which social judgment relied were less obvious than advertised. Clothing, manner, and expectation had done more work than nature alone. For moralists, this made the case useful in another direction. If appearances were vulnerable to manipulation, then the lesson to be drawn was not compassion for those shut out of work, but renewed vigilance. Respectable households and businesses were encouraged, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, to watch more carefully, to trust less easily, and to treat the poor with greater suspicion. The offense of one woman could thus become a warning against an entire class. This was another familiar operation of Victorian publicity. Particular hardship turned into general caution. Through all of this, the legal case continued on its own colder path. Employers gave statements. Goods were identified. Police assembled their facts. But the public was less interested in procedure than in revelation. It wanted to know how she looked, how she had spoken, how long she had sustained the disguise, whether anyone had guessed, whether she seemed ashamed, whether she had admirers, whether she wept, whether she was coarse or refined, hardened or innocent. In short, it wanted access to her body and bearing as evidence of an inner truth. This is the cruel intimacy of public scandal. It demands not only the fact of wrongdoing but the exposure of personhood as entertainment. For Lois, who had depended on controlling appearance, this must have been a particularly harsh reversal. The very quality that had served her best, her ability to become unremarkable within the role of a boy, was now stripped away and inverted. She could no longer disappear into ordinary labor. She was observed precisely because she had once gone unobserved. Every detail of dress, gesture, and expression now risked interpretation. If she appeared composed, it might be called hardness. If distressed, it might be called feminine weakness. If intelligent, she might be labeled cunning. If confused, pitiable. Public attention never restores complexity to the poor. It narrows them into a sequence of poses. And the newspapers were eager to supply those poses. One moment, she could be a dutiful daughter driven by family need. The next, an impostor who had violated the trust of respectable men. The shift between these two portraits did not require new evidence so much as a change in mood. That is what made public sympathy so unreliable. It was not anchored in a patient understanding of her circumstances. It was anchored in appetite. So long as the story of hardship and sacrifice remained the more pleasing arrangement, she could be indulged. Once the extent of the thefts and the repetition of the pattern came more fully into view, indulgence would begin to rot into suspicion, then disgust. At this stage, however, the rot had only begun. Lois still occupied that strange middle ground between criminal defendant and public curiosity. She was not yet fully condemned in popular feeling. There remained a chance, at least in the sentimental imagination of readers, that she might be redeemed by explanation. Perhaps she had done wrong only from hunger. Perhaps she had been led astray. Perhaps the disguise itself, so astonishing and unsettling, was proof less of vice than of exceptional distress. Society likes to flatter itself that its harshest judgments are reserved for the unworthy. In truth, it often delays judgment only until it has taken enough pleasure in the spectacle. There were, too, other complications the public did not know how to hold comfortably. Was Lois to be read as a woman who had merely borrowed male dress for practical ends, or as someone whose life in boys' clothing had become more than a temporary expedient? Did she feel the disguise as burden, instrument, or relief? Was she inhabiting a role she despised, or one that in some hidden way fit her better than the life available to her as a girl? On such questions the record remains all but silent. The period, when confronted with them, preferred not silence, but simplification. It collapsed uncertainty into moral narrative and left the deeper questions untouched. That simplification served the legal world as well. Courts did not need to resolve the full meaning of Lois's presentation. They needed only to recognize deceit where deceit had facilitated access. The wider mystery of personhood could be ignored. The practical offense was enough. Yet outside the courtroom, that unresolved mystery fed the case's strange power. It kept readers looking. It made Lois into something more than a thief and therefore, in the public imagination, something worse. She had become legible in the wrong way. The arrest had placed her under official control, but it also handed her over to a less formal jurisdiction, the hungry moral imagination of the city. There, she would be measured not only against the law but against femininity, labor, obedience, and the expected miseries of the poor. Every aspect of her life would be asked to prove something beyond itself. Her clothing would prove deception. Her family hardship would prove either pathos or manipulation. Her intelligence would prove either admirable resourcefulness or dangerous cunning. Her work record would prove trust betrayed. The woman herself would disappear behind the uses to which her story could be put. That disappearance is one of the saddest parts of the case, because there was a person beneath the novelty, a poor young woman from a strained household, with limited opportunities, uncertain schooling, and enough nerve to enter a world not meant for her. A person who had, by all available signs, crossed lines of dress and labor not for amusement but for survival or advantage or both. A person whose conduct, however judged, emerged from the hard material realities of the city rather than from abstraction. Yet public fascination rarely permits such plain humanity to survive. It prefers symbols, and by the time Lois stood exposed before it, she had already become one. The next stage would strip away the last softness from the story. Curiosity could not protect her forever. Sympathy, once attached, would soon begin to recoil from its own object. As the evidence hardened and the value of the stolen goods became harder to sentimentalize, the public would discover that it liked a curious daughter far better than it liked a repeated thief. Novelty had opened its heart a little. Repetition would close it. The arrest made her visible. What followed would make her punishable in the full moral sense of the word. Chapter 8. Sympathy turns sour. Public pity is often presented as a virtue. More often it is a mood. It rises quickly, especially where novelty and hardship can be arranged into a story that allows the comfortable to feel generous without being troubled too deeply. It lingers just long enough to flatter the giver. Then, at the first sign that the object of pity is more complicated than expected, it cools. In the history of poor defendants, this change of temperature appears with wearying regularity. A woman may be pitied while she seems passive, dutiful, hungry, or cornered. She is pitied less once she appears deliberate. She is pitied scarcely at all once she appears to have acted more than once, with method, and to have profited from it. Lois Schwich had, for a brief moment, occupied the favorable side of that line. The elements were all there. A young woman, boys' clothing, honest work, or something that could still be imagined as honest work. A mother, younger siblings, poverty near starvation. The spectacle of a daughter surrendering feminine appearance in order to feed a household was exactly the sort of narrative that late Victorian sentiment could embrace. It combined deprivation with sacrifice and made hardship legible in domestic terms. Readers did not need to imagine structural injustice, unequal wages, poor housing, or the narrowness of women's employment. They needed only to imagine a family in want and a daughter doing what she must. The story, in that form, could still be consumed tenderly. But tenderness of this kind rests on strict conditions. It requires that the poor remain morally legible to those above them. They must suffer in the right shape. They may endure, but not calculate too openly. They may be distressed, but not strategic. They may be unusual, but not so self-possessed that their unusualness begins to look like agency rather than misfortune. Above all, they must not continue doing wrong once sympathy has been extended to them. To do so feels, to the sympathetic public, like an insult. This was the danger gathering around Lois. Once the novelty of her appearance had done its first work, the more stubborn facts of the case resumed their place. Missing goods from one employer might perhaps be bent into the story of a desperate lapse. Missing goods from more than one employer were harder to soften. A single act committed under crushing need could still be framed as tragic. A repeated pattern suggested something else. Not merely want, but conduct. Not merely circumstance, but method. Sympathy, so eager in the abstract, recoiled from repetition because repetition implied choice. The newspapers, which had first helped manufacture the softer portrait, were perfectly capable of participating in its destruction. This was one of their talents. They did not need to contradict themselves openly. They merely shifted emphasis. Yesterday's unfortunate daughter became today's practiced deceiver not because the facts had wholly changed, but because the order in which those facts were presented had changed. Family hardship, once placed in the foreground, moved back. Value of stolen goods moved forward. The extraordinary disguise remained, but it was no longer picturesque. It became evidence of sustained dishonesty. The same intelligence that had first seemed pitiable in its necessity began to seem dangerous in its effectiveness. It is often said that public opinion is fickle. That is true, though the word can sound almost innocent. What public opinion often is, in cases like this, is punitive beneath its sentiment. It extends sympathy as a test. If the recipient does not remain within the form expected of them, sympathy hardens into a kind of anger. The poor are permitted to suffer, but not to make themselves troublesome in the process. Once trouble appears deliberate, pity begins to treat itself as betrayed. Lois had become troublesome in exactly that way. It was not only the theft that altered the public mood, but the scale and persistence suggested by the evidence. Small dishonesty might be treated as weakness. Repeated theft from respectable employers looked more like character. A woman who had sustained a disguise over years could not be dismissed as merely overwhelmed by one bad week. She began to appear, to those watching from the outside, as someone who had learned how to use her position. And once that impression took hold, the very qualities that had first excited admiration or compassion were recast in darker terms. Cleverness became cunning. Self-command became brazenness. Endurance became deceit maintained over time. The speed of this moral reclassification is striking, though not surprising. Victorian society was deeply invested in the idea that suffering ennobled only certain kinds of people. The worthy poor were expected to remain humble, grateful, and transparent. The unworthy poor were those who concealed, manipulated, improvised too boldly, or treated the social order as something to be used rather than obeyed. Lois crossed into this second category the moment it became clear that her disguise had not simply secured work, but had also secured repeated access to goods that could be stolen and turned into cash. At that point, her poverty ceased to make her sympathetic and began, instead, to make her suspicious. Need, when paired with ingenuity, was especially troubling to respectable observers. Ingenuity on its own might be praised in commerce, politics, or masculine striving. Need on its own might draw charity if suitably displayed. But ingenuity used by the poor to bend rules, cross boundaries, or exploit trust was treated as something almost perverse. It suggested not the endurance of hardship, but the refusal to remain in one's allotted place within it. Lois's whole case carried that offense within it. She had not merely suffered want. She had altered her appearance, entered male employment, moved through workplaces not intended for her, and, if the accusations were true, converted those opportunities into theft. It was too much initiative in the wrong body and at the wrong class level. One can feel the period's discomfort with this even in the way the case was discussed. Had she remained weak, broken, repentant, and visibly feminine, some portion of public feeling might have continued to cradle her. But the facts did not cooperate with such a posture. Whatever else Lois was, she had shown stamina. She had maintained a role over time. She had entered one job after another. She had, apparently, functioned capably within them until the pattern of theft forced exposure. These are not the features of a helpless person. They are the features of a person acting in the world, however compromised the terms of that action may have been. The public does not easily forgive such agency in a poor woman once it has been linked to wrongdoing. This is where sympathy began to rot into moral relish. The same readers who had likely thrilled to the pathos of the dutiful daughter could now enjoy the sharper pleasure of condemnation. Condemnation is often more satisfying than pity because it confirms the spectator's own moral steadiness. To pity someone is to entertain uncertainty, to admit the possibility that circumstances distort conduct. To condemn is to restore order. It permits the public to say that whatever hardships may exist, some people choose dishonesty and therefore deserve what follows. In this way, sympathy does not disappear so much as reveal its limit. It has served its emotional purpose and can now be replaced by judgment. The legal process encouraged this change, though it did not fully create it. As the case moved closer to court, facts acquired a harsher outline. Employers' losses were not romantic abstractions. They were counted, items were named, values were attached, patterns were laid side by side. Evidence that might initially have felt diffuse in newspaper summary appeared more concrete when connected through statements, recovered goods, and records. The public, hearing more, found it harder to sustain the earlier sentimental reading. Or perhaps it found it easier to abandon that reading because it had already taken from it what pleasure it could. There was another reason sympathy failed so decisively. Class trust had been offended. To steal from an employer is one thing. To do so after entering the employment under false presentation is another. But to do it in more than one establishment was to make the offense look systemic rather than incidental. Respectable employers, and those who imagined themselves in solidarity with respectable employers, saw in Lois's conduct something beyond ordinary dishonesty. They saw the manipulation of trust itself. She had not simply yielded to temptation in a moment of weakness. She had, in the harshest interpretation, built her access on misrepresentation. This made pity seem naive. Those who had extended it now risked appearing foolish. Nothing makes sympathy retreat faster than the fear of having been fooled. There is a particular embarrassment in pity once the object of it begins to look capable of exploiting pity in return. The newspapers, always alert to public embarrassment, responded accordingly. They could continue to rehearse the family story, but it now sat uneasily beside the accusation of repeated theft. The harder the evidence looked, the more that earlier tenderness seemed like indulgence granted too soon. In such moments the public often punishes not only the defendant, but the softer version of the defendant it had previously entertained. It becomes almost eager to prove that it is not sentimental after all. Lois's gender presentation intensified this reaction. Had she been a young man from the start, repeated theft might still have attracted condemnation, but not the same note of violated expectation. Because she had moved in male dress, because she had passed successfully, and because the public had first been invited to read that passing through the lens of family sacrifice, the collapse of sympathy took on the tone of revelation. She had not only deceived employers. In the minds of many readers, she had deceived them. The pathos they had extended now seemed to have been won under false pretenses, even though the facts of poverty and responsibility may well have been true. This was the trap at the center of her public image. She could not remain merely pitiable once she appeared competent. She could not remain merely competent once her competence was joined to theft. And because the newspapers had first introduced her through the softened frame of hardship, they had prepared the public for a sharper recoil when the harder frame returned. The movement from sympathy to censure was therefore built into the story from the beginning. It only needed enough evidence to complete itself. What was lost in this transition was the possibility of a more difficult understanding. A poor household might be real. Family dependence might be real. Educational limitation might be real. Restricted opportunities for women might be real. It might also be real that Lois stole repeatedly, knowingly, and with some degree of method. These truths do not cancel one another out. Yet public opinion prefers clearer shapes. It wants either the dutiful daughter or the hardened deceiver. It is impatient with the possibility that desperation and calculation can coexist in the same person without either fully absolving or fully explaining the other. The court, of course, did not need such psychological neatness. It needed facts sufficient for conviction. But the social world around the court always hungered for a narrative cleaner than life could supply. By the time Lois moved closer to trial, that narrative had hardened against her. Whatever sympathy remained was now conditional, private, perhaps even a little ashamed of itself. To speak too warmly of her risked appearing gullible. To condemn her, by contrast, was safe. One can imagine how isolating this must have been, though again the record does not grant her interior language for it. A person briefly held up as pitiable may experience the withdrawal of pity as a second exposure. It is not only that the crowd turns. It is that one sees how shallow the first embrace had been. If Lois had indeed attracted charitable interest or public softness, she would also have learned how swiftly such feeling can curdle once it no longer pleases those who offer it. For the poor, there is often something crueler in conditional sympathy than in open hostility. Hostility at least declares itself honestly. By this point, the sentimental version of her case was nearly spent. What remained now was the harder public image that would accompany her into court. A young woman who had lived and worked in male dress, obtained positions in respectable businesses, and stolen from those who had trusted her. Poverty did not vanish from the story, but it ceased to lead it. It became background, explanation if one wanted explanation, excuse if one wanted excuse, and irrelevance if one wanted punishment. The moral center of the case had shifted decisively from hardship to betrayal. This shift mattered because courts do not operate in perfect isolation from feeling. Even where legal decisions are formally grounded in evidence, the broader atmosphere surrounding a defendant shapes how that defendant is seen, described, and remembered. By the time the law spoke with full force, society had already arranged its own answer. It no longer wished to rescue Lois from the consequences of her life. It wished to place her within them and call that justice. The city had first looked at her with fascination, then with tenderness. Now it looked at her with the colder satisfaction reserved for those who have failed to remain simple. The trial would complete what public opinion had already begun. Chapter 9. Trial and Sentence. By the time Lois Schwich came fully before the court, much of her fate had already been prepared elsewhere. It had been prepared in the shops where trust first gave her access. It had been prepared in the small accumulations of loss that turned irritation into suspicion. It had been prepared in the pawnshops and records where missing goods acquired a trail. It had been prepared in the newspapers, which had first dressed her in sympathy and then stripped that sympathy away. The court did not create the case from nothing. It received it after the city had already worked upon it, reduced it, interpreted it, and made it legible in the harshest terms. What remained for the law was to give the matter its formal shape. Court has a way of shrinking a life. A poor defendant arrives with history, circumstance, habits, burdens, silences, private motives, and whatever tangled mixture of need, and has brought them to that point. The court is interested in only a fraction of this. It narrows the world to charge, testimony, property, sequence, and proof. It asks what was taken, from whom, when, in what quantity, and by what means the accused may be connected to the loss. It is not wholly indifferent to hardship, but hardship enters only at the edges, as explanation, mitigation, or moral color. It does not alter the underlying question of guilt. For someone like Lois, whose life had already been turned into a public puzzle about identity and deceit, that narrowing must have been severe. Whatever she had been in private, she now stood chiefly as the accused. The allegations against her had hardened into something plain enough for legal use. She had presented herself as male, obtained employment in more than one respectable business, and goods had disappeared during those employments. In the eyes of the court, the most provocative aspect of this was not novelty, but utility. The disguise mattered because it had helped secure access. It transformed what might otherwise have been read as a matter of ordinary workplace dishonesty into something more prepared, more deliberate. It suggested that deception did not merely accompany the alleged offenses, but stood at their threshold. This is often how law treats disguise. It is not interested in what disguise may have meant inwardly. It is interested in what disguise enabled. So the courtroom became the place where two incompatible versions of Lois were forced into contact. On one side stood the possibility, however diminished by this stage, of the poor daughter from a strained household, a young woman who had crossed into male dress to gain work otherwise denied her, and who had lived under severe pressure. On the other stood the defendant as the prosecution required her to appear. Not primarily burdened, but calculating, not merely unusual, but deceptive, not merely desperate, but repeatedly dishonest. The law does not always choose between such versions cleanly. Sometimes it absorbs fragments of both and still convicts. A defendant may be acknowledged as pitiable and punished all the same. In many ways, that is the more ruthless outcome, because it allows society to preserve its sense of compassion without surrendering any severity. The courtroom itself would have imposed its own discipline upon her. Whatever freedom of movement she had once possessed as an errand boy or porter, whatever command she had exercised over her appearance in shops and streets, now narrowed into fixed observation. She was no longer the one arranging the impression. Others arranged it for her. Employers spoke. Officials spoke. The articles taken, their value, the path by which they had been traced, the nature of her employment, and the fact of her presentation as male were all laid out within a frame that did not belong to her. The poor rarely speak in court with the same authority as those who accuse them. Even when they are permitted to answer, their answers come already weakened by the structure in which they are given. The evidence, as it was reported, was sufficient to carry conviction. This matters because it prevents the story from becoming something it is not. Lois was not swept into punishment on mere rumor or sensational dislike alone. Sensation amplified her case, certainly, and moral judgment gathered thickly around it. But the conviction rested on more material grounds. Goods were missing. Losses were connected to her periods of employment. Articles had been traced. Records existed. The same broad pattern had appeared more than once. The prosecution did not need to prove every depth of motive. It needed to prove conduct, and conduct had left enough behind it to be assembled against her. Still, the material facts were never quite enough for public satisfaction. Around them clung the older, more unstable questions. How long had she lived in male attire? Did she do so only for work, or more fully than that? Did she begin out of sheer necessity? Had she grown used to the role, even attached to it? Was the theft a late corruption of a hard-won disguise, or had the disguise always carried criminal opportunity within it? These questions hovered at the edges because they lent the trial a broader fascination than the theft alone could sustain. Yet the court, in its colder wisdom, had little need to answer them. It was enough that the disguise had been used, that trust had followed, and that goods had gone. That is one reason trials can feel so merciless. They do not need the full truth of a life. They need only enough truth to punish. The value of the stolen items played its part too. In a poor household, even modest sums could determine whether food was bought or rent met. In court, however, value operates differently. It becomes a measure of seriousness, an index by which repeated acts of dishonesty are translated into a scale the respectable can recognize. A theft of a few shillings might still be dismissed as petty weakness. Larger cumulative losses suggested a more settled criminal conduct. Once amounts were attached to the missing goods, the case took on the more emphatic shape of sustained offense. The public, already retreating from sympathy, found in these figures another reason to do so. The law found in them a reason to impose a sentence that would signify more than reproach. There is something especially bleak in the way courts handle the poor who have shown intelligence. Simplicity, confusion, youth, and obvious weakness may sometimes invite leniency, but cunning, preparation, and adaptability often provoke the opposite response. They suggest not a person overcome by circumstance, but a person capable of manipulating circumstance. Lois's success in sustaining her male presentation, obtaining more than one position, and moving through those positions with enough confidence to be believed would not have softened the view taken of her. It likely sharpened it. What in another context might have been recognized as resourcefulness appeared here as proof of dangerous capacity. One can almost feel the moral correction being applied. The city had permitted her, for a time, to step across a boundary. The court would push her back with interest. That was part of the symbolic work being done by the proceedings, whether anyone named it or not. A poor young woman had entered male employment, inhabited it successfully, and used it, according to the charges proven, for repeated theft. Such conduct could not be answered lightly, because its threat was not only economic. It challenged order, gendered order, commercial order, and the comforting fiction that trust placed in the right outward form was safe. Punishment restored those things theatrically, even if only for an afternoon in court. Yet for all that, the sentence finally imposed was not the wild extravagance of older penal eras. It was finite, measurable, modern in its way, and grimly ordinary. Imprisonment with hard labor. 8 months. The number sounds contained when written. It is less contained when lived. Hard labor was not simply confinement. It was punishment directed at the body as well as the will. It carried the old insistence that crime among the poor must be met not only by loss of liberty, but by disciplined physical degradation. Labor in such a setting was meant to humble, exhaust, and mark. For a woman who had spent years controlling appearance in order to survive, prison would have imposed a different and far harsher uniformity. The individuality of the disguise, the calculated ordinariness by which she had moved through the city, would have no place there. The institution preferred its inmates stripped of such self-fashioned identities. 8 months was also long enough to matter and short enough to reveal something about the court's reading of her. It was not a sentence of indulgence, nor was it the maximum savagery earlier decades might have inflicted for offenses connected to property. It sat in the recognizable middle ground of Victorian punishment, severe enough to warn, structured enough to look rational, and fully in keeping with the period's belief that labor and discipline might correct what poverty, deception, and crime had combined to produce. Whether anyone truly believed correction would follow is another matter. Often the sentence was less about reform than about public reassurance. The public wanted reassurance at this stage more than understanding. Whatever sentimental softness had once surrounded Lois's case was now largely gone. In its place stood the satisfaction of seeing a troublesome figure properly named and formally dealt with. The trial allowed respectable observers to close the uncertainty her life had opened. She was no longer the ambiguous daughter in disguise, no longer the curiosity passing through masculine work, no longer the subject of competing readings. She was a convicted thief. The sentence fixed that identity in a way newspapers and gossip alone could not. Conviction is one of the law's great simplifications. It reduces all prior instability to a declarative form, guilty, and therefore punishable. What it does not do is settle the deeper questions. It did not settle whether Lois first put on male attire out of hunger, ambition, personal affinity, practicality, or some combination impossible now to disentangle. It did not settle how she experienced those years of passing, whether as strain, liberation, concealment, or all three. It did not settle what family pressures stood behind her conduct, nor how much her household depended on her earnings, nor whether desperation and calculation had long ago ceased to be separable. It did not settle whether society itself had helped shape the path it was now so eager to condemn. These things lay beyond the sentence. The court closed the case in one sense and left it open in every other. Still, for Lois, the formal meaning of the day would have been brutally clear. The city that had once believed her now declared that belief misplaced. The employers who had once admitted her now stood vindicated. The public that had first entertained tenderness now had the authority of judgment to justify its coldness. The institutions of record, which had cared so little for the details of her life, while she struggled to remain afloat within it, now secured her a place in history through punishment. This is one of the lasting cruelties of the archive. Many poor people become visible to posterity chiefly because they are accused, exposed, or sentenced. So it was with Lois. The trial did not conclude her story in any emotional sense, but it concluded the version of her that had moved through London as a boy in search of work. That self, whatever compromises sustained it, could not survive conviction intact. Prison would interrupt it, perhaps destroy it, certainly alter it. The world of arcades, counters, parcels, and passing trust was closed to her now. In its place stood the regimented world of punishment, where the state claimed the right to correct what society had first produced and then disowned. And yet the case lingered because punishment was not the same as explanation. After the sentence, Lois remained what she had been all along. More difficult than the people around her wished to admit. A thief, yes. A deceiver, certainly. But also a product of poverty, of restricted female labor, of an urban culture obsessed with appearances, and of a city that rewarded performance until it suddenly chose to call performance fraud. The court could punish the offense. It could not simplify the life. Nor, in the end, could the sentence wholly erase the unease she left behind. A girl had become a boy well enough to be believed. A worker had become a suspect. A curiosity had become a convict. The law had spoken, and in speaking had restored outward order. But beneath that restoration remained the more unsettling truth, that the city's boundaries had proved permeable, and that one poor young woman had crossed them not in fantasy, but in fact. The prison door closed on the defendant. The question of who Lois Schwich really was remained outside, unanswered. Chapter 10. What Lois really was. After the sentence, the appetite for certainty remained. That is one of the peculiar afterlives of criminal cases. The law, having done its work, leaves behind not peace, but a residue of curiosity. People continue to ask what the defendant truly was, as if a life might finally yield its whole meaning once the punishment has been imposed. The question is rarely asked in innocence. It is usually a demand for moral arrangement. Was she wicked or unfortunate? Calculating or driven? Fraudulent or desperate? Did she steal because she was poor? Or because she was dishonest? Or because she had learned that poverty and dishonesty could be made to serve one another? The wish beneath such questions is not for complexity, but for release from it. Lois Schwich does not release the reader so easily. She cannot, because almost everything that makes her interesting also makes her difficult to settle. Had she merely stolen from one employer, she might have been grouped with any number of other working-class offenders and left there. Had she merely worn male clothing in search of wages, she might have remained a curiosity in social history. Had she been only poor, only dutiful, only deceitful, only unusual, the case would now lie flatter in the archive than it does. What keeps it alive is the convergence of these things in one person, under one city's pressure, in a society determined to separate what life itself had joined together. The temptation to simplify her is strong. It was strong in her own day and remains strong now. There is the sympathetic simplification first. In that version, Lois becomes the dutiful daughter, driven by hardship into disguise and then dragged into crime by need. It is an attractive reading because it preserves innocence as long as possible. It allows the reader to pity without discomfort. It frames the thefts as the sad overflow of deprivation and turns the disguise into sacrifice rather than strategy. There may be truth inside this version. Poverty almost certainly pressed hard upon her life. Family responsibility may well have shaped her choices. Honest work for poor women was badly paid, restricted, and uncertain. Yet this softer portrait cannot hold on its own. It strains against the fact of repetition. It struggles against the second employer, the second pattern, the evidence of goods taken and converted into money more than once. To read Lois purely as the victim of circumstance is to ask the record to become gentler than it is. Then there is the harsher simplification. In that version, she becomes a practiced impostor who used male disguise as a tool of criminal access from the beginning. Here the thefts take center place. Poverty recedes, or returns only as excuse. Intelligence becomes cunning. Resourcefulness becomes predation. The years in boys' clothing are treated not as a difficult adaptation to limited opportunity, but as proof of ingrained deceit. This version has its own appeal, particularly to those who prefer moral clarity over social inquiry. It explains repetition more neatly. It satisfies the desire to align crime with character. But it too is too easy. It asks us to forget the world that made such a disguise useful in the first place. It asks us to imagine that theft and deception emerged in a vacuum, untouched by hunger, gendered labor, or the deep structural contempt with which the poor were managed. Neither portrait is false. Neither is sufficient. What Lois really was lies somewhere inside the collision of both. She appears to have been poor. She appears to have carried family burden. She appears to have entered male employment because male employment opened where female employment did not. She also appears to have stolen, not once but repeatedly, and not in ways that can be dismissed as pure panic or accident. She was, in other words, both constrained and active, both shaped by circumstance and willing to exploit circumstance. That combination can feel unsatisfying to readers who want the emotional simplicity of either pity or blame. Yet it is probably the truest way to approach her. Poverty does not erase agency. Agency does not erase poverty. That truth is harder to bear than either of the simpler versions. It requires admitting that desperate people may act with calculation, and that calculated acts may emerge from desperate conditions without ceasing to be morally troubling. It requires seeing that the poor do not become abstract symbols of injustice merely because society has treated them unjustly. They remain people, and people improvise, conceal, resent, desire, endure, betray, and justify themselves in proportions no tidy formula can capture. Lois's case is powerful because it forces that recognition. It also forces another one. That identity itself, in her story, was part of the practical economy of survival. Much has been made of the fact that she presented herself as male, and rightly so. But what did that mean to her? This is where the archive grows thin, and all later certainty should become cautious. The public in her own day treated the male clothing as sensational. The law treated it as enabling deceit. Later readers may be tempted to treat it as either purely instrumental or deeply personal. It may have been both. It may have begun as expedience and become habit. It may have been a burden at first and a form of freedom later. It may have solved the immediate problem of wages while also altering how she moved through the world, how she was addressed, what spaces she could enter, and what version of herself became possible within those spaces. It may have answered one need while uncovering another. The record does not tell us enough to decide. That silence matters. It is not a blank to be filled with confidence, but part of the historical truth itself. Poor people, and especially poor women whose lives entered the archive through scandal, were seldom granted the language to explain themselves in full. Others explained them instead. Employers explained them as dishonest. Reporters explained them as pitiable or monstrous according to mood. Courts explained them as guilty. What is missing is the inward account. We do not know what Lois felt when she first found that a cap, a coat, and the manner of a boy opened doors that had remained closed to her before. We do not know whether she felt relief, dread, exhilaration, or some uneasy mix of all three. We do not know whether, by the end, the disguise still felt like disguise. And yet, even this absence teaches something. It reminds us how often the poor, and women among the poor, were rendered visible only at the point of transgression. No one had thought to preserve Lois's school records if they existed, or her childhood voice, or the full shape of her family life, or her own understanding of what she had become. But once goods went missing, once employers complained, once male presentation could be turned into a headline, then the record awoke. Society often ignores the marginal until the marginal become useful as warning. That is part of what Lois really was as well. A person made legible through punishment. She was also, undeniably, intelligent. Not educated in the grand sense, perhaps not even substantially schooled by formal standards, but intelligent in the sharper, more precarious sense that poverty often produces. She could observe and imitate. She could judge the expectations of employers. She could enter male-coded labor and remain convincing long enough to secure more than one position. She understood value, portability, timing, and the vulnerabilities of trade. None of these abilities should be romanticized. Intelligence does not become admirable merely because it is used under hardship, nor harmless because it arises from it. But to deny the intelligence would be false. Lois was not simply swept along by forces larger than herself. She read the city and learned to use it. That may be the most unsettling thing about her. Victorian society preferred the poor in two basic forms: obedient or degraded. The obedient poor justified charity and reform. The degraded poor justified punishment. A poor woman who read the rules accurately enough to cross their boundaries and exploit them did not fit comfortably into either category. She was too capable for easy pity and too socially revealing for simple contempt. Her life exposed the seams in the order around her. It showed how much of that order rested not on stable truths but on outward performance, hurried judgment, and unequal opportunity. No wonder the public first stared, then recoiled. To look at Lois too closely was to risk seeing the city itself with less confidence. So what was she? She was a daughter. Almost certainly, though the surviving record gives that role more as burden than intimacy. She was likely an elder sibling, carrying some share of household survival. She was a worker, and then a worker in disguise, and then a worker whose labor became entangled with theft. She was a thief. That word must remain. To omit it would be cowardly. Employers lost goods. Trust was broken. The law did not invent those things from nothing. But she was also more than the offense. She was a product of a narrow labor market for women, of urban anonymity, of the material usefulness of clothes, of the secondary economies that absorbed stolen goods, and of a culture that both worshipped appearances and believed too readily in what appearances promised. She was a practical invention of the city that later condemned her. In another social order, one can imagine parts of her life taking a different shape. A sharper education, better paid honest work. Some recognized pathway into trade, without the need for disguise. A household less dependent on a daughter's ingenuity. Such speculation does not absolve what she did, but it reminds us that character is always in conversation with conditions. Victorian London produced people like Lois not because crime was inevitable, but because the boundaries of survival were drawn so tightly that some would learn to live by crossing them. Even the thefts, looked at coldly, bear this mark of practicality rather than fantasy. She did not seem drawn towards flamboyant criminality. There is no grand gang mythology around her, no theatrical violence, no appetite for notoriety for its own sake. What appears instead is repeated use of access to obtain portable value. It is ordinary, transactional, and urban. That ordinariness can make it easier to condemn, but it should also make it easier to understand. Lois was not stepping outside the logic of the city. She was using one of its harsher languages fluently. Perhaps that is why the case lingers. Not because it offers a neat moral lesson, but because it resists one. It leaves behind the discomfort of unresolved proportion. How much was need? How much was choice? How much of the disguise was strategy? How much was adaptation? How much did poverty shape her? How much did she shape her response to poverty? Such questions cannot be answered with precision now, and perhaps could not have been answered even then. A life lived under strain is rarely transparent, even to the person living it. What remains, then, is not a verdict beyond the verdict, but a steadier way of seeing. Lois Schwich was neither a melodramatic innocent nor a monster in petticoats. She was not simply the brave daughter of sentimental retelling, nor merely the predatory impostor of moral recoil. She was poorer, cleverer, harsher, and more human than either version allowed. She entered a world that denied her direct access. She found a way in. She used that way for work. She used it, too, for theft. The same intelligence served both. The same city enabled both. The same society that first excluded her then punished her for what she had made of exclusion. That is what she really was. Not a lesson. Not a symbol fully contained by the uses others made of her. But a difficult human figure at the intersection of labor, want, disguise, and crime. A woman who borrowed the city's trust in appearances and, for a time, made it pay. A woman whose story survives because punishment preserved what ordinary life did not. A woman who still stands in the archive half obscured, neither redeemed by hardship nor flattened by guilt, but complicated in the old and stubborn way that real people are. The court called her guilty and moved on. History, if it is honest, must leave the door slightly open. Epilogue. After the headlines. When the newspapers had finished with Lois Schwich, they moved on. That was the ordinary pattern of things. A name flared briefly in print, attached to some offense, scandal, accident, or disgrace, and then receded behind the next disturbance. The public appetite that had once made room for curiosity, pity, and condemnation did not linger long enough to restore a life in full. It consumed the moment of exposure and left the person to whatever followed. For most of the poor, this was how visibility worked. Sudden, harsh, and temporary. They were seen most clearly at the instant they could be judged. So it was with Lois. After conviction, the record grows thin again. The woman who had briefly unsettled employers, readers, and moralists alike slips back towards obscurity. Prison receives her. The sentence is served or endured. The city, which had stared so intently once her sex and disguise became known, ceases to ask what became of her next. That silence is not accidental. It belongs to the same social logic that made the case possible in the first place. Society wished to know her only as a problem. Once the problem had been named and punished, further knowledge was no longer required. Yet disappearance from the headlines is not the same thing as disappearance from history. What remains of Lois Schwich is fragmentary, but the fragments are enough to reveal something larger than one prosecution. Her life, as far as it can now be followed, stands at the meeting point of several Victorian anxieties that respectable culture preferred to treat separately. There was poverty, which the period spoke of endlessly while failing to relieve it. There was women's labor, poorly paid, socially constrained, and often treated as morally safer precisely because it was less free. There was the city's dependence on appearance, on the quick visual judgments by which employers, customers, and strangers alike decided who belonged where. There was theft, ordinary and persistent, moving through the same streets as honest commerce. And there was the press, forever eager to turn one person's difficulty into a lesson for everyone else. Lois touched all of these things at once. That is why her story lingers more vividly than the paper trail alone might suggest. She was not simply a thief, though she was that. She was not simply a curiosity in male dress, though the public insisted on seeing her that way. She was a working-class woman who crossed into masculine labor because masculine labor offered something her own allotted sphere did not. Movement, access, employability, perhaps even a form of social breathing room. In doing so, she exposed how practical and how fragile those supposedly firm divisions between male and female work could be. It turned out that the boundary could be crossed not by force, but by clothes, manner, nerve, and repetition. Victorian society was not comfortable with that discovery. It preferred to imagine that order rested on something deeper than presentation. Yet Lois's case showed how much of daily life depended on surfaces being read quickly and confidently. Employers did not investigate essence. They looked at a body, a coat, a cap, a manner of answering, and made a decision. The city functioned because it had to make such decisions constantly. It could not pause long enough to verify every parcel carrier, shop boy, porter, or messenger. Commerce required speed. Speed required trust. Trust rested on appearance. Lois learned this, used it, and was later condemned not only for theft but for showing too clearly how the system worked. There is another reason the case matters. It reveals the narrowness of the routes offered to poor women. Much of the labor available to them was hidden, confined, badly paid, and morally policed. Washing, sewing, mending, chairing, service, childcare, piecework, all the endless, necessary, undervalued work on which households and industries depended. These roles demanded effort without granting much power. By crossing into male employment, Lois was not entering a paradise, only a different tier of hardship. Yet that different tier carried real advantages. Visibility of another kind, wages perhaps more regular, work in motion rather than in domestic confinement, and access to spaces where goods passed through many hands. Her choice, if choice it was, tells us as much about the restricted world behind her as about the risks ahead. That restriction did not produce theft automatically. Many poor women endured it without crossing into crime. But it formed the ground on which her decisions became intelligible. What the public could not bear was the possibility that deprivation and ingenuity might coexist without resolving into innocence. It wanted Lois to be either a sacrificial daughter or a cold deceiver. It could manage the first with a little sentimental generosity and the second with punitive relief. What it struggled to manage was the more human and less flattering possibility that she was both constrained and active, both burdened and manipulative, both shaped by hardship and willing to use what hardship had taught her. Such mixed truths are common in real lives and unwelcome in public morality. They ask too much of judgment. They suggest that society itself may have a hand in producing the conduct it later punishes. That suggestion lies quietly under every part of her story. For the historian, or for anyone looking back with steadier eyes, Lois Schwich offers no simple heroine and no satisfying villain. She offers, instead, a case study in the ways a modern city made and unmade identity. Dress was not merely symbolic. It was functional. It opened routes through work, movement, and social expectation. Poverty was not merely background. It was pressure, daily and material, shaping what looked possible. Crime was not a separate underworld floating beneath respectable life. It threaded through the same shops, trades, pawn counters, and streets on which respectability depended. The press did not merely report these tensions. It dramatized them, simplified them, and sold them back to the public as moral entertainment. And then, when the entertainment ended, it abandoned the subject to silence. There is a kind of historical injustice in that silence. It leaves us with punishment more clearly than personhood. We know that she was sentenced. We know something of what was alleged and proved. We know how others described her. We know almost nothing of how she described herself. No settled account survives of what prison did to her, whether she returned to female dress at once or reluctantly, whether her family remained dependent upon her, whether she found work again, whether she disappeared into ordinary poverty, or whether the city marked her thereafter as one more woman who had crossed too many lines to be trusted. The gaps are large. They cannot honestly be filled. But their very presence tells its own truth. People like Lois were rarely preserved except at the point of transgression. That is part of why writing her now still matters. To return to a figure like Lois Schwich is not to rescue her into innocence. It is to rescue her from simplification. The record called her dishonest, curious, pitiable, improper, guilty. All of those labels attached to part of the story. None completes it. She was also resourceful. She was observant. She was formed by a city that taught the uses of appearance and the value of goods in the same breath. She was a daughter of poverty and an agent within it. She lived in the space between what society prescribed and what survival sometimes demanded. If there is a lesson in her case, it lies less in personal morality than in social arrangement. A world that narrows women's honest choices should not be surprised when some seek dishonest ones. A culture that worships appearances should not be shocked when appearances are used against it. A city that teaches the poor the value of every portable object, every pawnable article, every visible sign of respectability, should not pretend astonishment when some of the poor learn the lesson too well. None of this removes responsibility. It does, however, widen it. Lois Schwich cannot be understood as an isolated aberration. She belonged to Victorian London as surely as its arcades, workshops, pawnshops, and newspapers did. She was one of the figures produced where commerce met want, where gender met labor, and where identity itself became a negotiable surface. Her life does not sit outside the story of the city. It runs through the center of it, though only briefly illuminated. And perhaps that is the final truth. She survived in print because something went missing. Cloth, goods, trust, the confidence of employers, the public's sentimental certainty. But beneath those losses was another, quieter one. The fuller woman disappeared almost at once behind the case made from her. What remains now is partial, and yet strangely durable. A young woman in boy's dress. An employee believed, then doubted. A defendant stared at more than heard. A convict. A name that should have vanished entirely and did not. She stands at the edge of the archive still, not asking to be forgiven and not submitting to easy condemnation. She asks for something harder. To be seen whole enough to trouble the categories that trapped her. The newspapers let her go. History need not.